The start of Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941 unleashed 3 German army groups onto the Soviet Union. Army Group North drove into the Baltic states towards its objective at Leningrad. Army Group Center smashed through Belorussia, aiming at Moscow, the Soviet capital. Army Group South was directed to seize the industrial and agricultural resources of the Ukraine, reaching as far east as Rostov-on-Don as a springboard for a further advance, threatening the oil fields of the Caucasus and perhaps even British possessions in the Middle East. By the middle of September, Army Group South, with its Hungarian and Romanian allies, was well over halfway to the Don, and 650,000 Soviet troops had been trapped at Kiev. However, 2 points of resistance had been left behind the German front line. The city of Odessa was still holding out on the Black Sea coast against a mainly Romanian besieging force. The Crimean Peninsula remained in Soviet hands, posing a serious problem for Army Group South headquarters. The Crimea had no economic importance for the Germans, but strategically it was vital. From its base at Sevastopol, the Soviet fleet could dominate the Black Sea, and from airfields in the Crimea, the Soviet Air Force could attack the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești that were crucial for the German war machine. Hitler in fact called the Crimea a Soviet aircraft carrier in their attack on Romania's oil. Of more immediate concern to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of Army Group South, was the threat posed to his right flank as he prepared to renew his advance after the Soviet disaster at Kiev. He could hardly leave the Crimea as an assembly area for a counter-offensive into his lightly garrisoned rear areas. On the other hand, if the Germans could occupy the Crimea, they would not only remove the threat to Ploiești and limit the Black Sea Fleet's operations, but one of the gateways to the Caucasus would only be a short sea passage away, across the Kerch Straits. The advance from Rostov would involve a long approach march across the almost roadless wastes of the Kuban steppe between the Sea of Azov and the Caspian Sea. The early arrival of German troops in the foothills of the Caucasus might encourage anti-Soviet feeling among the local population, and perhaps even prompt Turkey to join the Axis powers. Von Rundstedt assigned the mission of capturing the Crimea to his southernmost army, 11th Army. The army was also tasked to continue its advance towards Rostov. On the 12th of September, General of Infantry Erich von Manstein was appointed the new commander of 11th Army, and 5 days later he arrived at its headquarters in Nikolaev. Von Manstein was the embodiment of the Prussian military tradition. He served as von Rundstedt's chief of staff in the invasion of Poland in 1939, and by 1941 his reputation within the German army was well established. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, Manstein was commanding 56th Panzer Corps in Army Group North, and although he'd never served with armoured troops before, he soon proved his abilities with a run of successes. Manstein was quick to assess the difficulties in his task ahead. His orders emphasized the importance of capturing the Crimea quickly and getting a force across the Kerch Straits, but at the same time he was instructed to provide the southern wing of Army Group South's march on Rostov. 11th Army was expected to attack southwards to penetrate a heavily defended bottleneck to the Crimea, probably followed by the siege of a fortified naval base. However, at the same time, it had to try to keep up with Army Group South's armoured spearhead, 1st Panzer Group, in its exploitation battles to the east. At first, these tasks looked to be beyond 11th Army's resources. 2 Corps, 30th Corps with 2 infantry divisions and the motorized Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, and 49th Mountain Corps with 2 mountain divisions and an infantry division, were approaching the line from Melitopol to Zaporozhye as they pursued the retreating Red Army eastwards. A 3rd Corps, the 54th, was preparing to attack the Crimea across the fortified Perekop Isthmus, with only 2 infantry divisions in place, and another due to arrive after mopping up at Odessa and along the Black Sea coast. In addition, there was the Romanian 3rd Army that was affiliated to 11th Army, but not directly under Manstein's command. The general opinion amongst the Germans was that, having occupied Moldova, the Romanians had achieved their war aims and were in no hurry to take a fuller part in the war. Assessing his missions and the forces assigned to him, Manstein quickly decided that he could not give the same priority to both tasks. He decided to concentrate on the Crimea first, because an advance eastwards was too dangerous unless the Crimea was occupied, and because of the importance the German High Command put on reaching the Caucasus from Kerch. He began to regroup his forces. The strategic geography of the Crimea shaped Manstein's plans. The peninsula is a rough diamond shape, nearly 200 miles across from eastern to western tips and 125 miles from north to south. A belt of lakes and marshes known as the Sivash Sea separates the Crimea from the mainland. It's 15 to 25 miles wide and a horrendous military obstacle. There are only 2 land routes onto the peninsula. The Perekop Isthmus in the west is roughly 5 miles wide and cut by an ancient fortification known as the Tatar Ditch that is up to 50 feet deep. In the east, a railway runs along the Chongar Peninsula that is so narrow in places that the sea lies on either side of the embankment. Most of the peninsula is open steppe, with almost no settlements or defense lines. But the southern third is occupied by the Yala Mountains. They shield the southern coasts from northerly winds in winter, protecting the Black Sea coast. In the southwest lies Sevastopol, the great naval base. There are some less important harbours, such as Yevpatoria in the east, and Balaclava, Yalta, and Feodosia in the south, that played minor roles in the campaign. Finally, the port of Kerch gives its name to the peninsula that stretches eastwards and is separated by a narrow strait from the Taman Peninsula and the mainland north of the Caucasus. Although the Perekop Isthmus had been fortified in depth with 2 deep belts of defences, Manstein decided that he had no alternative but to fight a breakthrough battle there. The isthmus could not be outflanked, and the Germans had no amphibious resources for a landing operation. So Manstein reinforced 54th Corps with all the artillery and engineers he could find, and ordered 50th Infantry Division to join the Corps for the final breakthrough. Realizing that the breakthrough battle would almost exhaust 54th Corps, he pulled the German 49th Mountain Corps away from the battle in the steppes so that it could exploit the breakthrough and reach Kerch, from where the High Command wished it to advance into the Caucasus. Manstein hoped to use the motorized Leibstandarte division to take Sevastopol by a surprise thrust. This left only the 30th Corps to maintain the pressure on the retreating Russians, But Manstein managed to persuade General Dumitrescu, the commander of the 3rd Romanian Army, to move across the Dnieper River and join the eastwards pursuit. This added a cavalry corps and a mountain corps, each of 3 brigades, to the eastern push. But Manstein was still taking the conscious risk that the Russians would not stop their withdrawal and counterattack. Manstein would have liked to start the assault at Perekop on the 20th of September, but was forced to wait until the 24th. 11th Army had advanced over 300 miles since it crossed the Soviet border, and supply convoys were struggling to keep up over poor roads. On the Soviet side, the defense of the Crimea was entrusted to 51st Separate Army that had 4 infantry divisions, 4 militia divisions, and a cavalry group of 3 divisions under command, but these were mostly newly raised formations. The army commander, Colonel General Kuznetsov, did not really expect an attack on the Crimea. He deployed 3 of his infantry divisions under 9th Rifle Corps along the northern coast, with the 156th Rifle Division holding the Perekop Isthmus. Most of the militia divisions were dispersed to defend the coasts, and 2 operational groups were kept in the center of the peninsula to counterattack against any German assault. About 30,000 men defended the north of the peninsula. 40,000 men were along the coasts, and 25,000 were held in the operational groups in the center. When the attack began, Manstein had 3 divisions in his front line. During the night of the 23rd and 24th of September, the 22nd Division launched diversionary attacks away from the Perekop Isthmus. Supported by all available aircraft and artillery, 54th Corps launched 45th and 73rd Infantry Divisions into the attack at 4:30 on the morning of September the 24th. They were bitterly resisted by the 156th Rifle Division and had to fight for every machine gun post and pillbox. Manstein had expected this and had ordered his troops to bypass Russian strongpoints as much as possible. Using these tactics, 73rd Division managed to advance about 2 miles on the western side of the isthmus. But by the afternoon of the 24th of September, there was no sign of an early breakthrough. The grinding breakthrough battle continued for the next 3 days. Every battalion commander in 156th Rifle Division was killed as they tried to stiffen the defense by their personal example. The deputy commander of 51st Army, General Batov, led an operational group formed from 2 rifle and 1 cavalry divisions that began to move from the central part of the peninsula on the 25th of September to join the battle at Perekop. But the group had to march over 60 miles under constant air attack, delaying its advance. The Luftwaffe's total air superiority also helped the German infantry to deal with the defenses at Perekop. Just before dawn on the 26th of September, 73rd Infantry Division began its attack on the Tatar Ditch. After a concentrated artillery barrage, the infantry and assault pioneers slid into the ditch and struggled up the far slope. Gradually, a foothold was achieved, and during the following night, both divisions worked their way towards Armyansk at the back of the first belt of defences that was 10 miles deep. But Batov's counter-attacking forces drove the Germans out in a charge delivered just before first light. The battle for territory continued back and forth for another couple of days before the German advance finally halted. But it was not the Soviet resistance in the Crimea, however desperate, that prevented a complete breakthrough. Events on the steppe further north forced Manstein to change his plans completely. Despite its immense losses in the first 3 months of the war, the Red Army had managed to find new reserves. two armies, the 9th and the 18th, had been reformed and held a defensive line running west of Melitopol northwards to the Dnieper Bend near Zaporozhye. From the 22nd of September, they began to launch minor attacks that were checked without causing 11th Army much concern, although they began to wear down the resistance of the Romanian units sandwiched between the German divisions on this sector of the front. Eventually, these attacks increased in scale until more than 10 infantry divisions, with at least one armour brigade, started probing the gaps between German and Romanian formations. On the morning of the 27th of September, the tide began to turn. The 2nd and 4th Romanian mountain brigades began to weaken in the face of attacks led by tanks that their anti-tank weapons could not stop. German units were also coming under pressure. The 22nd Infantry Division between the Sivash and Melitopol had been reduced to the combat strength of a small regiment, and its commander was starting to talk of withdrawal. Wasting no time, Manstein reacted quickly. First, he ordered that there was to be no withdrawal. Second, he checked the forces moving to complete the breakthrough into the Crimea. 49th Mountain Corps and the Liebstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division were turned back, and Manstein moved his tactical headquarters to the northeast in order to make his presence felt among the wavering Romanian staffs. On the 29th of September, 49th Mountain Corps began a counterattack in support of the 3rd Romanian Army, and the northern arm of the Soviet counterattack was confirmed. The Liebstandarte was about to follow up this attack when a Romanian cavalry brigade gave way in the centre. Manstein was on hand to prevent this and swing the Liebstandarte division to oppose the threatened breakthrough on the 1st of October. Things were looking brighter for the Germans. The battle began to turn in their favour. Besides taking his own measures to check the Soviet advance, Manstein had been urging Army Group South to organise a major counterstroke. The Soviet 9th and 18th Armies were now fully engaged in the battle against 11th Army, leaving their northern flank vulnerable to a blow from General von Keist's 1st Panzer Army. Army Group South quickly seized the opportunity, and 1st Panzer Army began to cross the Dnieper at the Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk bridgeheads on the 1st of October. By the next morning, reports were reaching Manstein that the Russians were beginning to withdraw to the east. By the 3rd of October, 11th Army was able to order its eastern grouping to pursue the disappearing enemy. On the 6th, Melitopol was captured and 49th Mountain Corps linked up with von Kleist's panzers. By the end of the battle, over 100,000 prisoners had been captured, and the 9th and 18th Armies were ruined. The 11th Army took 27,000 prisoners, 130 guns, and 64 tanks. In Manstein's view, the Russians had missed a great opportunity. Their forces were so superior to 11th Army at the start of the operation that if they had been better led, they could have destroyed the German position south of the Dnieper. As it was, the road to Rostov was laid open for Army Group South. By now, Hitler had agreed that 11th Army could not fight a battle on two increasingly separated fronts, and gave orders for Manstein to concentrate on the Crimea. But he was also told to hand over 49th Mountain Corps and the Liebstandarte Division to von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army for the advance to Rostov. This left Manstein with 30th and 54th Corps, a total of 6 infantry divisions, most of which had been heavily engaged in the earlier battles. The 3rd Romanian Army was to take over coastal defence on the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. 42nd Corps, with 2 infantry divisions, was sent to the Crimea, although one division had to be diverted elsewhere before it arrived. Manstein was lumbered with a rather old-fashioned army, an infantry-artillery hybrid with no tanks under command, and still heavily dependent on horse transport. He was determined that 11th Army should have a mobile force that could exploit a breakthrough when it was achieved. So Group Ziegler was improvised from Romanian motorized infantry units and more mobile German elements. This was better than nothing, but it was a long way from the panzer divisions leading the terrifying German blitzkrieg. While 11th Army's attack was stalled, the Russians had been strengthening the Crimea's defences. South of Perekop, two small lakes split the isthmus into three narrow strips of land, two of which joined at the village of Ishun. This was the last good defensive position in the north of the peninsula. If it was lost, the Russians would be forced back to the southern mountains and the defences of Sevastopol and Kirch. They were determined to hold the Ishun position at all costs. In the first weeks of October, concrete pillboxes, minefields and anti-tank ditches were added to the defences up to 10 miles deep. The immediate defence of Ishun was assigned to General Batov's operational group of 4 small divisions. 51st Army's commander, General Kuznetsov, continued to hold more forces along the northern coast and in the centre of the peninsula, but they couldn't influence the decisive battle. Shortly after the German attack began, Kuznetsov was relieved of his command and replaced by the more determined Batov. In Moscow, Stalin had also come to realize that the defense of Odessa, however heroic, was a waste of troops. The garrison would be better used to fight Germans in the vital Crimea than the mostly Romanian force attacking Odessa. The evacuation was completed on the night of the 16th of October, and 86,000 troops, 500 guns and 20,000 tons of ammunition, plus tanks and vehicles, were landed in Sevastopol and Yevpatoria by the Black Seas Fleet. They were formed into the Coastal Army under General Petrov and began to assemble near Simferopol. All its divisions were under strength and short of equipment, but they were soon drawn into the struggle at Ishun. Manstein had no choice but to fight another attritional battle in horrendous conditions. With no feasible way to bypass the Soviet defenses, surprise and maneuver were impossible. At the start of the operation, Manstein could only deploy the 54th Corps and 3 divisions on the narrow strips of ground around Ishun, so the attackers didn't outnumber the defenders. Manstein could rely on his artillery, but this advantage was offset by the Soviet superiority in the air. Whereas 11th Army had benefited from the support of the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Corps in the earlier battle at Perekop, the Corps had now been ordered to support 1st Panzer Army as well. At this stage in the war, the German army was not used to operating without the Luftwaffe's support, and the lack of air cover began to sap the soldiers' morale. The offensive began on the 18th of October. On the first day, 54th Corps only managed to penetrate the Soviet outpost line. Meanwhile, 11th Army's war diary noted the Russians' extraordinary infantry resistance, strongly built-up positions, extensive minefields, intense artillery bombardments, and air resistance. In fact, a 10-day battle had begun that would test Manstein's qualities as a general to their limits. Visiting the front every day, he could see for himself the alarming way in which the combat power of his divisions was wasting away. Officer casualties were dangerously high, and staff officers had to be turned into frontline commanders. From the 22nd of October, the rain turned a dire situation into a living hell. Roads turned to mud, and supplies ran desperately short. Ammunition shortages threatened to stop some divisions. Manstein rose to the challenge. Although he couldn't avoid sending his troops into frontal attacks, he did ensure that these were always properly coordinated with the artillery and, when available, air support. He kept pressing his superiors to provide more air support until Goering sent reinforcements to 4th Air Corps. Fighters under Colonel Mulders, the first ace to be awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords and diamonds after his 100th victory in July 1941, were sent to hold the Soviet Air Force at bay while ground attack aircraft began to pound the Russian frontline positions. When the crisis struck after a week of slow, grinding progress, Manstein had to judge whether his troops could continue and if the Soviet defense was about to break. On the 27th of October, 54th Corps broke through the center of the defensive belt, and Group Ziegler was able to pass through and begin its dash to block the road to Sevastopol. The next day, the Russians began to withdraw, with the 51st Army retreating southeast towards Kirch, while the Coastal Army pulled back to Simferopol, covering the main road to Sevastopol. The nature of the battle changed immediately. Manstein had to ask his weary troops to pursue and, if possible, cut off the retreating Soviet forces. He hoped to seize Sevastopol in the rush and to prevent 51st Army's escape from Kirch. The German troops responded instinctively, capturing thousands of Soviet troops. But in the worsening weather, and with a very small mobile force, it was impossible to prevent significant numbers of Russians from escaping. The 42nd Corps reached the outskirts of Kirch on the 6th of November, but the port was only secured 10 days later, by which time about 40,000 Soviet troops had escaped by sea. Simferopol and the Yala Mountains were rapidly secured by 30th Corps, although some Russian troops escaped to operate as partisans from caves and other hideouts. However, as 54th Corps approached Sevastopol, it met stiffening resistance and even some counterattacks. In the end, the plan to capture Sevastopol from the march had to be abandoned, and 11th Army began to plan an early assault on the fortifications. But as the notorious Russian winter began to bite, problems started multiplying. Logistics were hit the hardest. In the Crimea, with its milder climate, continuing rain was the biggest problem. Most roads were unusable. But further north, the Ukraine was in the grip of ice and snow. South of the Dnieper River, only one railway engine was working, and 11th Army needed more than 3 trainloads of supplies each day to stockpile the ammunition for an assault on Sevastopol. Manstein had originally hoped to begin the attack on the 27th of November, but it was actually the 17th of December before the preparations were complete. Meanwhile, the Russians worked frantically to improve their defenses. On the 7th of November, Stavka, the Soviet Supreme Headquarters in Moscow, established the Sevastopol defensive region that was ordered to defend the besieged city to the last man. Vice Admiral Oktyabrski, commander of the Black Seas Fleet, was put in charge of the defensive region, and Major General Petrov, commander of the Coastal Army, was made his deputy for land forces. Oktyabrski had been working to improve the defenses since the summer, and by December, Sevastopol had become one of the most strongly fortified places in the world. Three defense lines covered the base. The forward line was 27 miles long and 10 miles from the center of Sevastopol. About 3 miles behind that was the main line, which was 23 miles long, running from the river Katcha in the north to Balaklava, south of Sevastopol. Finally, there was the rear line, which was 18 miles long and backed by an anti-tank ditch, covered by artillery and machine guns. Modern coastal defences batteries, armoured turrets on concrete emplacements with 44 guns of up to 12 inches in calibre, could cover the land approaches as well as the sea, and were reinforced by newly constructed positions using guns from damaged warships. The Sevastopol fortress contained 82 coastal and field artillery positions, 20 miles of anti-tank ditch, 35 miles of barbed wire entanglements, and nearly 10,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Petrov's coastal army had 4 rifle divisions that were each allocated a sector of the defences. There were also a number of naval infantry brigades and battalions, some of which had been raised from sailors in the naval base. The bulk of the Black Sea's fleet was withdrawn to Novorossiysk at the beginning of November, leaving 2 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and some small craft in the harbour. But the old battleship Sevastopol and a number of cruisers made a series of trips back to Sevastopol to bombard German positions. Destroyers and other small ships were responsible for resupplying Sevastopol, using darkness and bad weather to dodge German air attacks. Manstein was once again about to commit his troops to head-on attacks against strong defensive positions with inadequate resources, something far removed from the wide-ranging battles of manoeuvre for which he is famous. Yet again, he had no alternative. It would be impossible to launch a force across the Kerch Straits while Sevastopol held out in his rear. In planning the attack, Manstein decided that there were 2 possible lines of approach, from north or south. The hilly, wooded terrain in the centre made an attack from the east too difficult. The defences were weaker in the south, but the poor roads made it impossible for the Germans to assemble and supply a strong enough assault force from the Balaclava direction. The northern route was more practicable and led to the hills that commanded Severnaya Bay, the main anchorage. Manstein's resources were totally inadequate for an assault on a large fortified area. By early November, his army consisted of 3 German corps headquarters with 8 infantry divisions under their command, and the Romanian Mountain Corps. Only 2 of the infantry divisions were reasonably fresh and approaching full strength. One division, 72nd Infantry, had been so mauled in the earlier fighting that its companies numbered from only 12 to 61 men. 11th Army was a quarter under strength, with the largest shortages among the infantry who would have to lead the attack. Concentrating enough power to shatter the Sevastopol defences would mean taking a huge risk. Manstein allocated 42nd Corps headquarters to defend the coast against Soviet landings, but he allowed it only 1 German division and a Romanian brigade. They were concentrated in the Kerch Peninsula, where the threat of a landing seemed greatest. This left 7 divisions around Sevastopol. The main northern attack was to be delivered by 54th Corps, with 4 divisions that were to concentrate on pushing down the Belbek River Valley and seizing the Mackenzie Heights that overlook Severnaya Bay. A supporting attack by 30th Corps with 2 German divisions and the Romanian Mountain Corps would then advance from the southeast on the axis of the Chernaya River Valley. Meanwhile, the 50th Division was to attack from the east to link the 2 attacks and capture the commanding ground at Memorial Heights. But Manstein's plans would not remain intact for long. Manstein's tactics were once again upset by Soviet actions away from the Crimea. The 1st Panzer Army had reached Rostov, but the Red Army launched a counter-offensive into Army Group South's overextended northern flank on the 17th of November. In late November, von Rundstedt decided to order the 1st Panzer Army to withdraw from Rostov. But this order was countermanded by Hitler, who sacked von Rundstedt on the 1st of December. Because of the crisis at Rostov, Army Group South wanted to take 2 of Manstein's divisions from the Crimea. He protested, but could not prevent the loss of 73rd Division. This was the only division that was not committed in the line around Sevastopol or at Kirch, because it was earmarked as 54th Corps' reserve to complete the breakthrough to the heights north of Severnaya Bay. Despite the risk, Manstein had little choice but to press ahead with the assault. The attack was timed to start at 6:10 on the morning of the 17th of December. There was no preliminary artillery bombardment in the hope of winning an element of surprise. Instead, the artillery were to concentrate on the strong points in the Soviet line, trying to break the defenders' morale and help the assault infantry infiltrate as deeply as possible, cutting lines of retreat. On the first day, the furthest advance was achieved by the 22nd Division, which managed to press up to 5 kilometers down the Belbek Valley. But the other divisions were held up by the rugged terrain and determined Soviet resistance. The Germans continued to make slow progress until the 23rd of December, when the 22nd Division seized crucial ground north of the Belbek River and forced the Russians to withdraw their remaining forces in the northern sector. Both sides were rapidly using up their reserves. On the 20th of December, Stavka transferred the Sevastopol defensive region to the Trans-Caucasus Front, which was ordered to send reinforcements to the city. A rifle division and a naval infantry brigade were landed in Sevastopol a day later. But Manstein could get no reinforcements. 22nd Division kept moving forward, but the spearhead of its advance was getting smaller every day. On the 26th of December, its leading regiment almost reached Fort Stalin, one of the 2 great artillery batteries overlooking Severnaya Bay. But the division was on the verge of collapse. A reserve division could have completed the breakthrough, but Manstein had no reserves. If anything, the first assault on Sevastopol was about to fail, because early on the 26th of December, the Russians began to land troops on the Kerch Peninsula. Even as he started to move forces away from Sevastopol to meet this threat, Manstein ordered one more attack by the gallant 22nd Division, but Fort Stalin held out. Manstein was forced not only to call off the attack on the 30th of December, but also to order the division to pull back to a less exposed position on the northern side of the Belbek Valley. 5 months would pass before he could turn his attention back to Sevastopol. The Kerch landings were not a small diversion, but part of the strategic counter-offensive that Stalin had ordered along the whole Eastern Front in December 1941. The Trans-Caucasus Front, with the Black Sea Fleet and the Azov Flotilla, were in the process of landing over 40,000 men in Crimea. The original Soviet plan was to land 20,000 men of the 51st Army on either side of Kirch, at the eastern end of the peninsula. Meanwhile, 44th Army, with 22,000 men, would land at Feodosia in the west and move north and cut the peninsula at its narrowest point at Parpak. However, bad weather and the need to send reinforcements into Sevastopol made it impossible to launch the attacks together. 51st Army was only able to land about 3,000 men on the 26th of December, and because of the winds and rough seas, it took 5 days to get 20,000 men ashore in a number of small and isolated beachheads. The 46th Infantry Division, the German garrison in the Kerch Peninsula, was beginning to deal with the beachheads in turn when 44th Army started to land at Feodosia on the morning of the 29th of December. The only German troops present were an engineer battalion that had been billeted in the town for the night. As wave upon wave of Russian troops came ashore, the German battalion was soon pushed inland. The defence of the Kirch sector was the responsibility of 42nd Corps, under Lieutenant General Graf von Sponeck. Alarmed by the landings at Feodosia, he ordered 46th Division to pull out of the Kirch Peninsula before it was cut off. Manstein countermanded the order, but von Sponeck's headquarters was already moving back, and radio contact had been broken. 46th Division got clear, but lost most of its transport and heavy equipment in the process, so that when Manstein ordered it to turn about and attack, the division could only manage a show of obedience. Manstein relieved von Sponeck of command, but Hitler insisted on a court-martial. The court, chaired by Goering, sentenced von Sponeck to death. In fact, the situation at Kirch and Feodosia was not as serious as Manstein had feared, largely because the two Soviet armies failed to exploit the opportunities in front of them. Both concentrated on securing the perimeters around their beachheads and made little attempt to expand them. As a result, Manstein was given time to move troops from Sevastopol, although his redeployment was delayed on the night of the 4th and 5th of January when the Russians landed troops at Yevpatoria on the west coast, north of Sevastopol. This was a daring blow, accompanied by a parachute landing and an uprising of partisans in the town. However, 11th Army improvised a battle group around 105th Infantry Regiment with some artillery, engineers and Luftwaffe ground troops. Yevpatoria was recaptured after 3 days of fighting. Then a thaw struck, turning the roads back into mud tracks and slowing the eastward move of 30th Corps. By the 14th of January, Manstein had managed to assemble 3 German divisions, plus a Romanian division and 2 Romanian brigades, for an attack on the Feodosia beachhead. The 44th Army had 4 divisions in the beachhead, and there were at least 4 more nearby in Kirch. The Russians had had over 2 weeks to prepare their defences, and if the German attack failed, they might have been left too weak to hold their positions in the eastern Crimea. Nevertheless, Manstein decided to go ahead rather than allow the Russians to bring in more reinforcements. He had obviously come to a low opinion of the opposing Soviet generals, whose defensive mentality suggested that they and their troops were afraid of the German army. On the 15th of January, the attack began. It took 4 days to drive the Russians out of Feodosia. Around 17,000 Soviet troops were killed or captured, but Manstein was disappointed that a large number escaped to the east. He began to prepare to follow up the capture of Feodosia by clearing the Kirch Peninsula. Army Group South promised him more air support, and Panzerabteilung, or tank detachment, with 60 to 75 tanks newly arrived from Germany. This was the first German tank unit to arrive in the Crimea, and the attack was set for dawn on the 26th of January. Then on the 24th, Army Group South called the tanks away to deal with a greater threat in the north. Manstein cancelled the attack immediately and shifted his army to wait on the defensive until the weather improved. The Russians, however, were not yet ready to abandon their hopes of driving 11th Army out of the Crimea. With the Kerch Straits frozen over, it was possible to bring tanks and vehicles, as well as men, across from the Taman Peninsula. Unfortunately, the weather was not reliable, and a series of thaws slowed the build-up of Soviet forces. Even so, by the beginning of February, the Soviet forces in the Crimea, now known as the Crimean Front, consisted of 4 armies. The Coastal Army in Sevastopol, and the 44th, 47th and 51st in the Kirch Peninsula. Together they commanded 17 rifle divisions, 4 mountain divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, and a large number of independent brigades and regiments. They were backed by 5 tank brigades and some smaller tank units. By comparison, 11th Army had only 7 German infantry divisions and 2 Romanian divisions, plus 2 Romanian mountain brigades and a cavalry brigade. The Germans still had no tanks. A Soviet attack was clearly imminent. In fact, Stalin was so impatient that he sent Lev Meklis, the chief commissar of the Red Army, to hurry the preparations. Meklis had taken a leading role in Stalin's purge of the officer corps. No general would dare delay an attack, however ill-prepared, if Meklis was at his side. The Soviet offensive was ordered for the 27th of February. German intelligence knew the date and even dropped leaflets over the Russian front line announcing this. Despite this, Meklis refused to delay, and the Russians attacked as predicted. They were most successful in the north, where 18th Romanian Division was driven back for 5 miles. At the same time, the Coastal Army began a series of attacks from the Sevastopol perimeter. Although at least 35 attacks were launched by the Coastal Army in a week, they were successfully checked by 54th Corps, and Manstein was even able to move another regiment across to Parpach. The fighting on the Parpach sector continued until the 3rd of March, when the Russian attacks were halted, officially because the ground was too soft for the tanks and resupply had become too difficult. But in reality, the Russian tanks were not being used effectively. Middle-ranking and senior officers did not yet have the skills and experience required to coordinate tank and infantry units. However, the weight of Soviet armor opposing 11th Army did convince the German High Command that the newly raised 22nd Panzer Division, with the mobile 28th Light Division, should be sent to the Crimea. The ground began to freeze again on the 8th of March, allowing the Russians to build up their supplies and prepare to renew their offensive. They began on the 13th of March, attacking over the whole front, but concentrating their main effort in the north. Even though the Germans estimated that they had destroyed 200 tanks by the 19th of March, they could not halt the growing salient in the north. Manstein obtained permission to use the 22nd Panzer Division, even though it was still arriving in the Crimea. On the 20th of March, the division attacked, accompanied by the 46th and 170th Infantry Divisions. It ran into a Russian assembly area, and the attack backfired. Operating with the corps headquarters and flanking divisions that it had never trained with, 22nd Panzer had an uncomfortable baptism of fire. But Manstein felt that the arrival of German tanks would severely limit Soviet operations. New offensives were launched on the 26th of March and the 9th of April, but both were rebuffed after a few days. By the middle of April, both sides were locked into a grinding stalemate. Neither side had the power to launch an attack, but the initiative was shifting towards 11th Army. Manstein opted to begin the summer campaign with an attack at Kirch, choosing to destroy the stronger Soviet grouping first. His staff began to plan Operation Bustard Hunt. Although it was clear that the Germans were preparing an attack, the Crimean front, thanks to Meklis, did not abandon their own attack deployment. Instead of creating the deep defensive layout required by the open terrain of the Kirch Peninsula, all but 2 of the Soviet divisions were deployed within 2 or 3 miles of the front line. To make matters worse, the Russians were convinced that the Germans would concentrate their attack against the northern part of the line, where they had attacked in March. The 47th and 51st Army were packed into this salient that bulged invitingly into the German area. The 44th Army was left to cover the southern part of the Parpak Isthmus. But Manstein could see no point in attacking either the western face or southern flank of the Russian salient. He was not interested in simply pushing the Russians back towards Kirch, where they might escape back across the straits. He wanted to cut off and destroy the whole enemy force. This would not be easy, given that his forces were outnumbered by at least 2 to 1. Manstein sought every advantage he could find to compensate for his numerical weakness. A detailed deception plan was organized. 42nd German Corps and 7th Romanian Corps made very obvious preparations for an attack in the north, including simulating troop movements, building dummy artillery positions, sending false radio traffic, and carrying out very obvious reconnaissance of the Soviet line. On the other hand, no major troop movements were allowed into the 30th Corps area in the south until the night before the attack. When Manstein visited Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg on the 16th of April, he insisted that the strongest possible air support would be required. As a result, 8th Air Corps under Baron von Richthofen was assigned to support Bastard Hunt. 8th Air Corps was the Luftwaffe Specialist Ground Support Force and was reinforced to a strength of 460 aircraft for the battle. It was ordered not just to attack frontline positions, but to check the movement of Russian reserves or any attempt to pull back. The plan for the ground attack was that 30th Corps should lead the way with 3 infantry divisions. They were to break through the Russian defences and secure a route for the 22nd Panzer Division and a supporting infantry division. Their specific task was to enable 22nd Panzer Division to cross an anti-tank ditch at the back of the Soviet defences. To help in this task, an infantry battalion was loaded into assault boats to outflank the ditch by sea, though the boats were really designed for use on rivers. Once it was clear of the ditch, the Panzer Division was to drive northeast and cut off the retreat of the 2 northern armies. The 42nd and the 7th Romanian Corps would help to destroy the encircled force, while a special mobile group under Colonel Grodek would lead 2 of 30th Corps divisions in a dash to prevent Soviet reserves or retreating forward units occupying prepared lines in depth. Manstein insisted that the attack should be prepared by the 1st of May, but that it would not be launched until the weather was suitable. Fine weather was essential to dry the ground for the tanks and allow the Luftwaffe to bring its full weight to bear. Operation Bastard Hunt finally began on the 8th of May and ran almost exactly to plan. Almost every Soviet division was engaged on the first day of the operation, leaving almost no reserves. In any case, the Soviet command system was so disrupted by air attacks that the front command soon lost control of the forces. Rain during the night of the 9th and 10th of May threatened to delay the committal of the 22nd Panzer Division, but when the weather cleared and the ground dried, it became clear that the Russians were not trying to withdraw. They were still trying to hold their positions in the north and restore the line in the south by counterattacks. The 22nd Panzer Division fought some fierce tank actions, but could not be stopped from reaching the northern coast early on the 11th of May. While 42nd Corps, under General Mattenclot, coordinated the destruction of the encircled Russian divisions, Frete Pico's 30 Corps drove on towards Kirch. 42nd Corps had wiped out the northern pocket by the 13th of May. The next day, von Grodek's mobile group reached the coast, though he was mortally wounded on the way. By the 15th, Kirsch was in German hands, and 3 Soviet armies had been annihilated in a week. 11th Army had captured 170,000 Soviet troops and over 1,100 guns and 250 tanks, at a total cost of just over 7,500 casualties. Operation Bustard Hunt was a miniature example of blitzkrieg tactics, planned and executed by one of the greatest masters of the art. However, Manstein still had unfinished business at Sevastopol. That would be a very different sort of battle. At the time of the German siege, Sevastopol was said to be the most strongly fortified place on Earth, and that its defences could only be breached by a massive concentration of the heaviest artillery. 208 artillery batteries were brought into position on a 22-mile front around the city. Most of these guns were conventional field artillery, but they included a unique array of specialist heavy weapons. 12 11-inch coastal artillery howitzers were the smallest of these guns, and there were another dozen 14-inch howitzers. Guns of this size had been widely used in the First World War, and all the major armies still had a number of such weapons in their armories. But the Germans had also developed some super-heavy guns that had no equivalents elsewhere. Gamma and Karl were mortars, but far removed from weapons used by the infantry. The 6 Gamma mortars had a caliber of 42 centimeters, and the 3 Karl mortars were 60-centimeter weapons. Although both types had huge tracked carriages that allowed them to move short distances under their own power, longer moves required the use of special road trailers or rail wagons. Dwarfing even these monsters was Dora, the largest gun ever used in action. In 1918, the Germans had bombarded Paris with the famous Big Bertha. The bombardment was not very effective, but the German army had been mortified that such a prestigious weapon had been developed and operated by the Navy. Between the wars, the army had been determined to develop its own supergun, and this had been achieved at the Krupp's works, where it was known as Gustav, after the head of the Krupp's family. The gunners who crewed the monster preferred their own nickname, Dora. The 80-centimeter caliber gun fired 2 types of shell. A 4-ton shell could be fired nearly 30 miles, and a 7-ton concrete-busting round had a 23-mile range. The whole system weighed about 1,350 tons and took over a month to assemble. The firing detachment consisted of 500 men, but altogether 1,420 men, under a major general, worked to support and protect the weapon. From Soviet accounts, it seems that some of the most effective guns used by the Germans during the siege were anti-aircraft weapons. Because 8th Air Corps had air supremacy in the Crimea, its commander, General von Richthofen, was able to allocate an anti-aircraft division to work with the ground troops. Its 20mm, 37mm and 88mm guns were very mobile and could be brought into positions where they could destroy fortifications by direct fire. They were especially effective against the smaller earth and wood bunkers that the Russians had built all through the Sevastopol defences. These were very difficult to locate and destroy with conventional artillery, but could hold up an infantry attack for a long time. The high-velocity shells of the anti-aircraft guns could knock these bunkers out with 1 or 2 shells and allow the attack to continue. The decision to complete the conquest of the Crimea had been taken in the spring of 1942. It would have been possible to leave Sevastopol with a smaller screening force and use the bulk of 11th Army to cross the Kerch Straits and assist Army Group South's drive to the Caucasus. But Hitler had a fixation with the capture of famous cities, and Manstein argued that it would be operationally unsound to leave the Red Army a bridgehead in the rear of Army Group South. So preparations were made for an assault on Sevastopol, starting as soon as possible after the close of Bastard Hunt. The new plan was called Operation Blue. The defenders had not been idle during the 5-month pause in the siege. Although they'd lost much of the first defence line and the most northerly part of the main defences between the Kacha and Belbek rivers, most of the fortified gun positions were still in Soviet hands. These were supplemented by new field fortifications dug into the caves and crevices of the rugged hills around the port. New minefields were laid, using over 100,000 mines of all types. Reinforcements and supplies had been brought across the Black Sea, and the garrison now consisted of 7 rifle divisions and a number of naval infantry and other independent brigades that were almost at full strength. Their total strength was 106,625 men. They knew an attack was imminent and were determined to hold Sevastopol at all costs. Signs began to appear on the fortifications that read, "Come on, fascist dogs, we are waiting." As in December, Manstein was obliged to make his main attack in the north. The one winding road along the coast was not suitable for heavy traffic, nor did the ground allow long-range observation of artillery fire. However, it was vital to prevent the Russians from massing too large a force in the northern sector. 30th Corps were allocated 3 divisions and about a third of the artillery for a supporting attack. Their objective was the Sapun Heights, a naturally strong ridge that had been used by the British and French armies in the Crimean War to protect their besieging force from Russian attempts to relieve Sevastopol. The battles of Inkerman and Balaclava had been fought in front of the Sapun Heights, and the British war cemetery on the ridge became part of the Soviet fortifications. North of 30th Corps, the Romanian Mountain Corps was responsible for a holding operation on the unfriendly ground of the Yala foothills. The main effort was to be made by 54th Corps, with 4 divisions and a reinforced regiment, supported by about 2/3 of the available artillery, including almost all the super-heavy guns. 42nd Corps, with 1 German division and some Romanian units, was left in the Kerch Peninsula, in case the Russians tried to repeat December's amphibious landings. Manstein was under great pressure from Hitler and the Army High Command to complete his preparations and to capture Sevastopol as quickly as possible. He knew that if there was any delay that threatened Operation Blue, the assault might be called off and 11th Army would be left in a strategic backwater. The air and artillery bombardment began on the 2nd of June. While the Luftwaffe attacked the city and harbour to disrupt Soviet communications, the artillery concentrated on counter-battery work. The permanent fortifications were easily identified and provided the first targets for the heavy guns that achieved some success. On the 6th of June, Dora fired 7 rounds at Fort Molotov and another 8 at an ammunition dump known as White Cliffs. Smoke and flames were seen coming from both positions. One shell had in fact penetrated 90 feet of rock to destroy the ammunition dump. On the same day, Karl knocked out one of the gun turrets on Maxim Gorky 1 with a direct hit. It was equally important to locate and neutralize the Soviet field artillery in their camouflaged positions. At first, these guns did not respond, but once they revealed themselves, they were subjected to a steady bombardment. The infantry assault began on the 7th of June, but there was no quick breakthrough. It was a grim struggle, reminiscent of the Battle of Verdun in the First World War. The Russians fought to the last man in their pillboxes and larger fortifications. If they lost ground, they tried to win it back by immediate counterattacks. After 10 days, some of Manstein's regiments were so exhausted that they numbered only a few hundred men. One company consisted of an officer and 8 men, and the average strength was barely 25. Manstein exchanged the weakest regiments with new units from the Kirch Peninsula so that the divisions could stay in line. The 17th of June proved to be a turning point. Both German corps suddenly changed their axes of attack. 54th Corps, having finally captured Fort Stalin and won a foothold on the Mackenzie Heights, turned west, and 6 more forts fell that day, including the famous Maxim Gorky 1. The same day, 30th Corps managed to seize a position known as the Eagle's Perch, in front of the Sapun Heights. The Corps concentrated on broadening this penetration to form a start line for an attack on the heights themselves. 54th Corps spent the next few days clearing the northern shore of Severnaya Bay. German artillery now dominated the harbour, and supplies could only be brought in at great risk. The submarine M32 was nearly lost while delivering petrol supplies. As it lay on the harbour bottom to avoid daylight air attacks, leaking petrol fumes almost knocked out the entire crew. One chief petty officer remained conscious, and he managed to bring the submarine to the surface. The Russians were still defending their positions ruthlessly, but they no longer seemed to have the reserves or the ammunition for counterattacks. Once again, the critical moment was approaching, and again it was Manstein who sensed the changing balance and found the means to tip it in 11th Army's favour. Although the Germans had broken through the main belt of defences, the rear position was untouched. It was based on the steep Sapun Heights and ran from Inkerman in the north to Windmill Hill and Fort Maxim Gorky 2 on the south coast. There seemed no alternative to a frontal attack by 30th Corps, but the roads in that sector were not good enough to move the heavy artillery and ammunition that would be required. It is a mark of Manstein's desperation at this point that when the fall of Tobruk in North Africa was reported, he asked Army Group South if the commander of the British garrison could be sent to the Crimea. Manstein thought that he might be dropped into Sevastopol by parachute, and that this proof of German success in siege warfare would create a strong demoralizing effect on the Soviet defenders. Not surprisingly, nothing more was heard of this plan, and shortly afterwards Manstein produced the idea that was the key to final victory. On one of the daily visits to forward units, he went to an artillery observation post in the 54th Corps area that had an excellent view over Severnaya Bay. The bay was the main fleet anchorage and up to 1,000 yards wide. The southern shore was well defended, with tiers of strong points dug into the cliffs. But Manstein began to wonder if it would be possible to launch an attack across Severnaya Bay and then take the Sapun Heights defences from the flank. 54th Corps' staff were not enthusiastic. How could they even get assault boats down to the shore, let alone across the bay, in the face of such defences? Manstein's response was simple. If the Russians considered an attack across Severnaya Bay to be impossible, they would not expect the Germans to even attempt it. For that reason alone, the Germans had to attempt it. Everything would depend on achieving surprise for the crossing that was set for the night of the 28th and 29th of June. There was to be no artillery preparation, but every available gun stood by to bombard the southern cliffs if the alarm was raised as 100 assault boats crossed the bay. The leading regiments were ashore before the Soviet defenders realized what was happening, and as dawn broke, 30th Corps joined in by threatening a wide frontal attack on the heights, but then launching a concentrated attack by 170th Division along the main road to Sevastopol. With massed airstrikes and the direct fire of an anti-aircraft regiment, the division reached the crest and then broadened its penetration so that other divisions could move up in support. 28th Light Division captured the strongpoint at the British cemetery on the ridge, as 170th Division pressed on until it reached the Khesonas Peninsula at the western tip of the Crimea. The Russians were forced back to the Crimean War fortifications, and on the 30th of June, the famous Fort Malakoff was captured. By now, the defenders were short of ammunition and other supplies, and suffering a day-long aerial bombardment from 8th Air Corps. Admiral Oktyabrsky received Stavka's permission to evacuate Sevastopol that night. Several hundred high-priority personnel were carried off by air, and about 3,000 managed to escape in light craft of the Black Sea's fleet. On the 1st of July, resistance collapsed, although some positions held on for a few more days. Maxim Gorky II was the last fort to be captured. And even then, some of the defenders refused to surrender and were buried alive when German engineers exploded demolition charges. The 11th Army had finally conquered the Crimea. Hitler was delighted with the victory, which seemed a good omen for the start of the 1942 campaign. Manstein was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal, and a special Crimea Shield was awarded to all the personnel of 11th Army. On the Soviet side, a medal for the defense of Sevastopol was instituted, and after the war, Sevastopol was named as one of the hero cities of the Soviet Union. It was right that both sides recognized the individual valor of their ordinary soldiers, who overcame appalling conditions and fought beyond the limits of endurance. At this stage of the war, the tactical skills of the German soldier could still compensate for the numerical superiority of the Russians, but the Crimea campaign showed they were equal in courage. However, although the Red Army had some very able and determined commanders, Manstein had that touch of military genius that proved decisive and swung the balance in the Crimea. Unfortunately for Germany, he was not allowed to remain in southern Russia. Hitler decided that Manstein's genius lay in capturing trophy cities, and he ordered that his new field marshal and the greater part of his 11th Army should be transferred to the other end of the Eastern Front and conquer Leningrad. Even though one of the original objectives of the Crimean campaign had been to put at least a strong force over the Kerch Straits to help capture the Caucasus, the striking power of Manstein's army was dispersed over the Eastern Front. The invasion of the Caucasus continued. But as Hitler's attention became centered on Stalingrad, the campaign faltered. The Russians kept control of the oil fields and most of the Black Sea coast. After the fall of Stalingrad, the Germans were forced to retreat, but managed to hang on to the Kuban bridgehead, including the Taman Peninsula, and so deny the Red Army a route back to the Crimea. In 1943, the strategic focus lay in central Russia, where the Battle of Kursk proved that the balance was definitely turning against Germany. Army Group A under Field Marshal von Kleist held on to the Gottenkopf position in the Kuban throughout the summer of 1943, but the Soviet advances in the Ukraine after Kursk left it hopelessly isolated. Hitler gave permission to evacuate the Kuban on the 3rd of September, and most of von Kleist's men were hurried through the Crimea only just in time before the Red Army's advance across the southern Ukraine reached the Black Sea coast between the Crimea and the river Dnieper. The Crimea was cut off, and the German and Russian armies once again faced each other across the Sivash. In November, the Black Sea Fleet and the Azov Flotilla carried troops of the North Caucasus Front across the Kerch Straits. At first, they could only cling on to two small beachheads at Kirch and Eltigen, but at the end of the year, new landings at Feodosia on the North Shore put most of the Kerch Peninsula back in Soviet hands. As the winter operations came to an end, the Crimea was still occupied by a German and Romanian force under the 17th Army, commanded by General Erwin Jeinecke. One opportunity to evacuate the peninsula had already been lost in late October 1943. Jeinecke and the commander of Army Group South Ukraine, Field Marshal von Kleist, had both called for the peninsula to be abandoned once the Kuban evacuation was complete. They were told that Hitler would not allow the word Crimea to be mentioned in his presence. Marshal Antonescu also wanted to get his troops out of the Crimea, but Hitler insisted that it must be held. His justification was that the Crimea could be used as a base for air attacks on the Romanian oil fields, or for amphibious landings on the Black Sea coast of Romania and Bulgaria. Von Kleist therefore told Jeinecke to defend the Crimea. At first, Jeinecke refused, saying he would not be responsible for another Stalingrad. After a bitter telephone argument, he gave in. Although the generals continued to press for a sea evacuation during early 1944, Hitler refused to accept that there was no strategic justification for holding the Crimea. In fact, he insisted on reinforcing the 17th Army, which grew from 1 division to 5. With a mass of logistic units, Russian volunteer troops and laborers, Luftwaffe and naval personnel, there were nearly 250,000 men in the Crimea, although only a small proportion could be described as combat troops. The Russians were in no hurry to begin an attack. Their propaganda mocked the Crimea as their biggest and safest prisoner of war camp, where the Germans fed and guarded themselves, and if they left on leave, came back of their own accord. But the Soviet General Staff were preparing a series of offensives that would sweep up and down the Eastern Front throughout 1944. The opening move would be in the north, to free Leningrad from its 3-year-long siege. Then the Red Army would strike in the south to complete the liberation of the Crimea. The battles would be fought over the same ground as Manstein's campaign of 1941 and 1942, but both armies were very different organizations. The German army was no longer riding on a wave of 2 years of unbroken success. Although it could still win small victories, the big battles eluded them. Manstein had fought with divisions that were often under strength, but reinforcements had always arrived. By 1944, the German manpower pool was becoming exhausted, and divisions, regiments, battalions often existed only in name. The German soldier would still fight with skill and courage, but increasingly from desperation rather than belief in his inevitable victory. The Russian soldier knew that the German army could be beaten and was determined to take revenge for the damage done to his homeland. Although the Red Army did not have limitless manpower resources, its units were maintained at combat-effective levels, and soldiers and junior leaders were no longer badly trained. The greatest change in quality, though, was among the generals. It was the German high command who were now most affected by the dictatorial whims of an incompetent political leader and his cronies. Most of the great leaders of the early years had lost Hitler's trust. Manstein himself was sacked by Hitler at the end of March 1944. Stalin, on the other hand, had settled into a reasonable working relationship with his general staff. His generals understood each other well and had developed an operational formula that made the best use of the Red Army's strengths and disguised its weaknesses. The coming offensive in the Crimea, like the other strategic offensives of 1944, would demonstrate that the Red Army was no clumsy steamroller, winning by sheer numbers, but a flexible and sophisticated military machine, mastering the classic military virtues of surprise, concentration, maneuver, and speed. The generals directing the operation were typical of the new breed of Russian field commanders. The group of officers who planned and commanded the Crimean operation provide a typical cross-section of the Soviet High Command in the final stages of the war. The oldest was Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, who had been a comrade of Stalin during the Russian Civil War, particularly during the fighting at Tsaritsyn, later renamed Stalingrad. When Stalin came to power, he appointed his old comrade Commissar for War in 1925, a position he held until 1940. The war with Finland and the first year of the war with Germany highlighted Voroshilov's incompetence, and Stalin used him as a scapegoat for early defeats. However, he escaped the purges that destroyed better commanders and was given a series of high-sounding but unimportant appointments. In sending Voroshilov as Stavka representative with the Independent Coastal Army, Stalin was rehabilitating his loyal supporter. But he took good care to send General Stemenko, the very competent head of the operations department, to make sure that nothing went wrong. Voroshilov represented the old guard of politically reliable but militarily incompetent commanders who had plagued the Red Army at the start of the war. The new breed was typified by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, the chief of the General Staff, who was sent to oversee the 4th Ukrainian Front. He was not yet 50, but had been identified as one of the brightest brains of the young Red Army between the wars, and was promoted quickly within the General Staff until he became its head in June 1942. However, he spent less than half his time in Moscow. Once the basic work of planning an operation had been completed, Vasilevsky was usually sent out as a Stavka representative. These men were the links between Stalin and the generals commanding the armies and fronts or groups of armies in the field. Vasilevsky took a leading role in all the Red Army's great victories, such as Stalingrad and Kursk, the 1944 offensives, and the war against Japan in Manchuria in 1945. He was a quiet and calm man who might have been a priest or a teacher, but for the Bolshevik Revolution. His professional ability was unquestioned, and he was never seen simply as Stalin's messenger by the front commanders whose operations he supervised, including General Tolbukin. Fyodor Tolbukin had been a front chief of staff during the First Crimean Campaign, which left his career under a cloud. However, he redeemed himself by his performance as an army commander at the time of Stalingrad, and as a front commander throughout 1943. He was a meticulous planner, and before the attack on the Crimea, spoke to every regimental commander to make sure that he understood exactly what his troops were required to do. By 1944, every Soviet front seemed to have a reliable commander such as Tolbukin, capable of planning and executing complex operations to a strict schedule. One potent weapon the Soviets had was numbers. At the start of the operation, the German defenders of the Crimea numbered just over 200,000 men, whereas the Russians had 470,000 waiting to strike. They were backed by nearly 6,000 guns and mortars, compared to 3,600 German weapons. The Russians also had 560 tanks and self-propelled guns, opposing 215 German armored fighting vehicles. The greatest Soviet advantage was in the air, where the Luftwaffe had less than 300 planes to face 1,250 Russian aircraft. But the Germans were holding strong defensive positions on the narrow isthmuses at Kirch and Perekop, and a quick victory was not guaranteed. The Germans had faced and beaten such odds before. The Russians could attack the Crimea from two directions, from Kirch or from Perekop and the Sivash. Stavka decided to use both axes. The main attack would be launched in the north by Tolbukin's 4th Ukrainian Front, with a supporting attack by the Independent Coastal Army at Kirch starting 2 or 3 days later. To oppose them, the German 17th Army had 5 German and 7 Romanian divisions. 3 German infantry divisions under 49th Mountain Corps and a Romanian cavalry division and 2 infantry divisions forming the 3rd Romanian Cavalry Corps were deployed in the north. The 5th Corps held the Kirch Peninsula with 2 German infantry divisions, a Romanian mountain division and a Romanian cavalry division. Coastal defence and anti-partisan security was in the hands of a mixture of Romanian units. Deep defences had been built at both Perekop and Kirch. The Germans knew that they had to hold the Russians in those sectors where the ground was narrowest, preventing the Russians from deploying their full strength. Once these defences were breached, the Germans would be unable to repel the Soviet armoured forces in the wide open spaces of the central Crimea, and would have to fall back to Sevastopol. Defence lines had been constructed around the city, but the Germans had neither the time nor the resources to rebuild the shattered Soviet fortifications. However, they could hope to hold the Russians long enough to organise an evacuation across the Black Sea. The main blow had to come in the north, where it was possible to assemble and supply an overwhelming force of artillery, armour and other troops to support the assaulting infantry. The obvious, if only, axis of attack was over the Perekop Isthmus, which had been used in Manstein's attack. The German defenders were concentrated in this sector. However, in their drive across the Ukraine at the end of 1943, the Russians had managed to seize some small bridgeheads on the southern shore of the Sivash Sea. They were too small to use as assembly areas for a major force, but Soviet engineers began to build causeways and footbridges back across the Sivash. They were built at night, often using German prisoners as labourers, and were hidden from air reconnaissance because they lay just below the surface of the water. 2nd Guards Army would pin down the main German force by attacking at Perekop, but the main blow would be delivered by 51st Army across the Sivash. For 5 days before the attack, heavy artillery pounded strongpoints in the German line. The assault began on the 8th of April with a 2.5-hour bombardment by every available gun, mortar and rocket launcher. Second Guards Army led the way, and after 2 days' struggle managed to pass the first line of defences at Perekop, but were held at the next line in the Ishun Defile. But while German attention was fixed on Perekop, 51st Army was winning the battle further east. Using the underwater roads and various boats and pontoons, wading through the freezing water where necessary, the Soviet troops shook the 10th Romanian Division, whose resistance collapsed on the 9th of April. By the next day, the Soviet front line was clear of the narrow defiles between the lakes, and 19th Tank Corps was moving forward. General Yeinecke gave the order to retreat to the Gneisenau stop line in front of Simferopol. On the 9th of April, the Coastal Army had begun its attack at Kirch. Under steady pressure, the Germans were forced to withdraw to their rearward lines across the narrowest part of the peninsula at Akhmonai. But when the Russians began their breakout in the north, there was no point in delaying any longer. 5th Corps began its retreat to Sevastopol. Those units falling back along the winding coast road were able to keep stopping and checking the pursuing Russians. But those who moved over the more open ground north of the Yala Mountains had a more difficult task. Like their comrades retreating from Perekop, they were harried by mobile groups formed by every Soviet formation. Manstein had improvised similar detachments in the mobile stages of his operations, but in 1944 the Russian groups were far better equipped and much more powerful. They were trained to bypass points of resistance and press on into the enemy rear, seizing crossing points and communication centres, and reaching reserve defences before they could be occupied by the Germans. The German and Romanian forces had to keep moving, or they were cut off and surrounded. Units got back to Sevastopol, but they'd been shredded by the relentless pressure. Equipment had to be abandoned, and the men who escaped death or capture arrived at Sevastopol with no more than a personal weapon and a rucksack. During its 150-mile march from Kirch, the 73rd Infantry Division lost nearly 4/5 of its men. Perhaps there were as many as 120,000 men in Sevastopol on the 16th of April, but 17th Army considered that its real combat strength was no more than 25,000 German soldiers in the 5 Kampfgruppen, or battle groups, which were all that were left of their 5 divisions. The troops in the Kampfgruppen were ready to fight on, but they also assumed that they would be evacuated in the end. But as often before, military logic made no impression on Hitler. He chose to believe the most optimistic reports about the strength of the Sevastopol defences and the ability of Navy and Air Force to support the besieged force. He argued that it was necessary to hold the city in order to keep Turkey neutral for another couple of months, long enough to beat off the expected Anglo-American landings in France. He refused to allow an evacuation and sacked General Yeinecke because of his continued protests. About 65,000 men were left in Sevastopol at the beginning of May, facing 3 Soviet armies with 27 divisions and over 450,000 men. The German plan for the defence of Sevastopol assumed that the Russians would have to make their main attack in the north, as Manstein had done, because the road and rail network was so much better there. So most of their infantry and mobile artillery were concentrated north of Severnaya Bay to deny the Russians the Mackenzie Heights. However, once again, Tolbukin thought he could make a major attack over ground the Germans considered unsuitable. He began with a feint attack in the north, where 2nd Guards Army attacked the Mackenzie Heights early on the 5th of May. But 51st Army and the Independent Coastal Army were to strike the decisive blow against the Sapun Heights east of Sevastopol. Under cover of darkness, the assaulting force was assembled for an H-hour on the 7th of May. The attack began with a 90-minute artillery bombardment, with 200 guns firing on each kilometre of the attack front. But the key to success was concentrated air power. After 2 days backing 2nd Guards Army, 8th Air Army switched 1,000 aircraft to support the new attack. By the middle of the morning, the red flag was flying on the Sapun Heights, and the fate of Sevastopol was sealed. With defeat staring the Germans in the face, Hitler finally authorized an evacuation, late on the 8th of May. It was far too late. A final position had been prepared on the Chersonas Peninsula, and as 19th Tank Corps was released from Balaclava, the Germans abandoned Sevastopol in a rush to reach this last refuge. And on the first night, the 9th of 10th of May, 15,000 men were taken off the peninsula. However, once daylight came, the Soviet Air Force struck at the convoys. Only a small number of men were rescued during the next night. A convoy of a dozen ships got to within 25 or 30 kilometers of the shore during the 11th of May, but at least 4 of them were sunk by air attack while they waited for landing craft to ferry troops to them. Conditions on shore were equally grim. The last days were spent under constant air and artillery bombardment. The wounded and the non-combatant troops were crammed into the passageways of the ruined Soviet coastal forts, while the remaining fighting troops clung to their trenches on the bare Chersonas plateau. Drivers, cooks and clerks took up arms and joined the front line. At least 20,000 men were left on the Chersonas. Resistance was hopeless, and they began to surrender, marching off into captivity in long columns for the benefit of Soviet newsreel cameras. Some preferred to risk the sea and set out in any boat or makeshift raft they could find. Most were drowned, but during the night of the 12th and 13th of May, the first motorboat flotilla made one last sweep and picked up 83 men, the last remnant of 17th Army. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within 3 days, Britain, France and their empires were at war with Hitler's Reich. Newspapers, newsreels and radio commentators loudly proclaimed the beginning of the Second World War. Neutral nations reasserted their non-belligerence. Some, like Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg, wedged between the major belligerents, were armed as well as they could be and were prepared to fight for their neutrality. Others, like Denmark and the countries of the Scandinavian peninsula, Finland, Sweden and Norway, were sufficiently far from the likely fields of battle to hope that they might avoid being drawn into the conflict. Such hopes were to prove futile. Scandinavia was very important to both the USSR and Germany. The southeastern border of Finland was only 32 kilometers from Leningrad. If Finland could not convince the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, that she would never allow her territory to be used by Germany in an assault against the USSR, then it was likely that Stalin would take preemptive action. Ironically, Germany had not yet developed plans to attack the Soviet Union via Finland. What did concern Hitler, though, was the possibility that Britain and France would move against Norway in order to cut Germany's supplies of high-grade iron ore. This commodity, vital to Germany's war industries, was transported from the mines of northern Sweden via railway to the Norwegian port of Narvik, where it was shipped south along Norway's long and vulnerable coast. Hitler was not wrong in his apprehensions. Almost from the moment he entered the Admiralty on the 1st of September, the new First Lord, Winston Churchill, had been planning to do precisely this. So as Hitler and Stalin were dividing Poland, they and Winston Churchill were all looking north to Scandinavia. To most of the world in 1939, the Soviet Union appeared huge and threatening. In the east, large battles had already been fought between Soviet forces and the Japanese Kwantung Army along the borders of Manchuria and Mongolia. To the west, Nazi Germany was moving steadily eastwards. In the previous year, Hitler had absorbed Austria, the Sudetenland, Bohemia-Moravia, Slovakia, and was now making demands that Poland relinquish the Danzig corridor. For nearly 2 years, the USSR had been conducting low-level diplomatic conversations with Finland in attempts to reinforce guarantees of Finland's continuing neutrality. For its part, Finland had no desire to become a satellite of the Soviet Union and had looked first to her Scandinavian neighbors, particularly Sweden, for support in the event of a confrontation with the Soviet Union. When Russian pressure frightened Sweden off, Finland held discussions with Great Britain, and on the 18th of June 1939, General Sir Walter Kirk arrived on a 4-day visit to Helsinki. A week after Kirk's visit, the chief of the Wehrmacht's General Staff, General Halder, arrived in Helsinki for an inspection of Finland's defences. News of Halder's visit to Helsinki reached Moscow on the 30th of June. On the same day, Stalin instructed Shaposhnikov, the chief of the Soviet Army's General Staff, to draw up a contingency plan for a war with Finland. For much of the summer of 1939, Moscow was gripped by the fear that Germany might launch an imminent attack through Finland. However, the signing of the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact on the 24th of August transformed the situation. Germany and the USSR, at least for a time, would make common cause. On the 1st of September, German forces struck deep into Poland, cutting off Polish army groups that had deployed too far forwards and rapidly closing in on Warsaw. On the 17th of September, Soviet armies rolled across Poland's eastern frontiers, and a few days later met German units at Brest-Litovsk. Stalin had the beginnings of a buffer against further German expansion, and he lost no time consolidating it. On the 22nd of September, Foreign Minister Molotov summoned the Prime Minister of Estonia to Moscow, an invitation that was extended to Latvia and Lithuania in the first week of October. The result was that each of these countries entered into mutual assistance treaties with the USSR, which were tantamount to their absorption into the Soviet Empire. A similar summons went to Helsinki on the 5th of October. The Soviet Union demanded that Finland cede islands in the Gulf of Finland, lease the peninsula of Hanko to the USSR, give up much of the Raibachi Peninsula on the Arctic coast, move the frontier in the Karelian Isthmus region westward to a point only 20 miles east of Viipuri, and destroy all existing fortifications on the isthmus. Given the disparity in power between Finland and the USSR, these terms appeared moderate, but to most Finns they were the thin end of the wedge. When the final meeting took place, Stalin was in an almost jovial mood. He shook hands with every member of the Finnish delegation and wished them well. The Soviets were certain the forces they were assembling would, within a very short time, be dictating peace terms in Helsinki. In the autumn of 1939, Joseph Stalin was at the height of his powers. Since the death of Lenin in 1924, the party's membership secretary, once thought of as a colourless clerk, had systematically removed his real and potential enemies from the party's bureaucracy, while at the same time removing masses of class enemies like the kulaks. Since 1937, the Soviet Union had been reeling from his purges of the upper echelons of the Soviet army. By the summer of 1939, only one marshal survived, Zhukov, whose remote posting in the Soviet Far East may have saved his life. Virtually all generals had also disappeared. Indeed, it was only at the level of lieutenant colonel that an officer had more chance of surviving than not. The result of these purges was that Stalin was isolated. He depended on information fed to him by a network of subordinate agencies, more so than any contemporary leader. Terrified that they too would be purged, there was a natural tendency on the part of subordinates to tell Stalin what they supposed he wished to hear. The Russian embassy in Helsinki reported that Finland was paralyzed by class strife, and that the Finnish proletariat would rise up and welcome a Soviet army as liberators. Stalin then expected his armies to occupy Finland within a few days, in an operation rather like the occupation of the eastern part of Poland after the 17th of September. Looking southeast from Helsinki, Finland's most prominent soldier, Baron Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, expected very much the same outcome. He had spent the autumn of 1939 pleading with the civilian government to take the Soviet demand seriously. But he still had no success. Mannerheim prepared to resign. He had no wish to be party to a policy that he was sure would cause the destruction of Finland. During the 1930s, the Soviet army had become fully mechanized and motorized. Maneuvers held in Kiev in the summer of 1935 and 1936 demonstrated to the world an awesome military power. Soviet forces, organized into tank and rifle armies, were configured to break open an enemy's front and then penetrate into the enemy's strategic depth. The concept, known as deep battle, had been the brainchild of a group of brilliant theorists who had gathered round Marshal Tukhachevsky. Unfortunately, Tukhachevsky and virtually all his lieutenants had been purged during the course of 1937, which left the Soviet army with an offensive doctrine that very few knew how to put into practice. To make matters worse, all Soviet units had commissars attached to them, political officers, whose job it was to supervise the ideological obedience of the military. There was no longer such a thing as a purely military decision. Every action had to be countersigned by the commissar. All Stalin's generals had been hugely impressed by the success of the German armored offensive in Poland, which Western journalists were now calling a blitzkrieg. Stalin too wanted a blitzkrieg, in which Soviet armored columns smashed into Finland. Finnish strategy depended on enhancing the natural defensive properties of the Finnish terrain with man-made fortifications. The border, 1,000 kilometers long, could be easily penetrated, but invaders would find their advance confined to the very few roads that ran through a wilderness of dense pine forests and a maze of lakes and rivers. So instead of being based on defeating the Russians, which was acknowledged to be impossible, Finnish planning relied on delaying them for long enough for sympathetic nations to intervene. The Finns believed major Soviet thrusts across the border from the north of Lake Ladoga to the Arctic were unlikely. Logistic problems alone seemed to rule out operations in this remote area. Much more likely was a strike directly north from Leningrad across the Karelian Isthmus, the 120-kilometer neck of land between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. Here, the Finns had constructed 109 reinforced concrete positions across the entire width of the isthmus. It was strongest on its flanks, where it was covered by fixed coastal artillery. The most dangerous section of the line was astride the shortest route between Viipuri and Leningrad, where two major roads went through the village of Suma and towards the village of Lahde. The Finns erected vast fields of barbed wire entanglements and laid thousands of mines along the most likely approach routes. The entire Karelian Isthmus was belted as well by a line of anti-tank obstacles, 5 to 7 rows deep, granite monoliths that had been sunk into the earth. Although it couldn't be compared to the Maginot or Siegfried lines, it was better than nothing. Mannerheim thought that with a little luck, it might hold the Soviets up for a week to 10 days. By the last week of November, the Soviets had deployed a force which numbered 450,000 men and included 23 rifle divisions, 2,000 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft, which represented about 25% of the USSR's active service strength at that time. As the Finns anticipated, the heaviest concentration was on the Karelian Isthmus. Here, Soviet 7th Army consisted of 12 rifle divisions, 1 mechanized corps, 3 tank brigades, and 12 artillery regiments, which amounted to 200,000 men and 1,500 tanks. What the Finns had not anticipated was that the Soviets would deploy sizable forces all along the 800-kilometer frontier, which ran from the northern shore of Lake Ladoga all the way to the Arctic coast. To the immediate north of Lake Ladoga was the Soviet 8th Army. 6 rifle divisions and 2 tank brigades, comprising 130,000 men and 400 tanks. Further north, 9th Army had deployed 5 rifle divisions in 3 separate columns. While in the Arctic, 14th Army had 3 rifle divisions. All told, 9th and 14th Armies consisted of 140,000 men and 140 tanks. The Soviets had achieved a crushing superiority over the Finnish army of 3 to 1 in manpower, 80 to 1 in tanks, 5 to 1 in artillery, and 5.5 to 1 in aircraft. These force ratios had only been achieved by drafting in an enormous number of raw recruits, who at best were capable only of the most rigid operational and tactical maneuvers. But this did not really matter if the leadership was solid. In overall command of operations against Finland was General K.N. Meretskov. Hard-working and with a highly developed sense of what was politically possible, Meretskov was no fool. In a report to his Leningrad party boss, he warned of the inherent dangers of crossing Finland's perilous terrain. On the 29th of October, Defense Commissar K.E. Voroshilov ordered Meretskov to develop an operational plan for the encirclement and complete annihilation of the Finnish army by means of coordinated land, sea, and air attacks. A month later, all was ready. Soviet air forces were to strike the main population centres of Finland, paralysing the main communication and transportation system, and destroying the small Finnish air force. Simultaneously, the Baltic Fleet would bombard and neutralise Finnish coastal fortifications, while naval landing forces seized key islands in the Gulf of Finland. While these operations were still underway, Soviet armoured columns were to strike deep into the heart of Finland on 4 major axes of advance on a 1,000-kilometre front, from Karelia in the south to Petsamo in the north. Within days, it would all be over. To face this onslaught, Finland had managed to mobilise about 180,000 men, organised into 8 infantry divisions and a number of independent battalions. The main strength was concentrated on the Karelian Isthmus, where 6 divisions of 2 corps took up defensive positions along the Mannerheim line. To the north of Lake Ladoga, manning a line of about 100 kilometres, were another 2 divisions organised into another corps. The remaining 1,000 kilometres to the Arctic Sea was covered by the North Finland Group, a collection of civic guards, border guards and activated reservists. Most Finnish units were made up of men from the same geographical regions. Company, platoon and battalion officers were usually well known to their men from peacetime and were often addressed by their first names or nicknames during combat. There was probably less saluting and less parade ground spit and polish than in any other army in Europe. Finnish troops knew they were in the army to fight. Finnish commanders were to experience 2 very different types of combat: a grinding, attritional defensive battle in the Karelian Isthmus, and a war of rapid manoeuvre and sudden ambush north of Lake Ladoga. Mannerheim's commanders at the operational level in Karelia were General Hugo Österman, commander of the Army of the Karelian Isthmus, and his corps commanders, General Harold Olqvist, who commanded 2nd Corps, and General Erik Heinrichs, who commanded 3rd Corps. They were intelligent officers, capable of highly flexible responses to difficult situations, but they lacked experience. The men disagreed with Mannerheim's argument for a layered defence of the Karelian Isthmus, and were much more enthusiastic about launching a counter-offensive when the initial Soviet thrust had been blunted. The Jaeger tradition of Finnish officers was put into practice in the forest fighting north of Lake Ladoga. Here, the heroes of a guerrilla war on skis emerged to capture the popular imagination, not just of Finland, but of virtually the entire world. Men like business executive Paavo Talvela, the prominent lawyer Jalmar Stalasvuo, and the rabble-rousing right-wing politician Kurt Wallenius led their forces with a flair and a dash completely foreign to the Soviet army of that time. At least one famed Finnish ski commander, Kurt Wallenius, discovered that he couldn't take the pressure. Appointed to command a hastily formed reserve on the Mannerheim line in late February, he immediately took to the bottle to steady his nerves and stayed drunk for 3 days. On the 3rd of March, Mannerheim relieved him of command. The Finns knew that in any war with the USSR they would be on the defensive, but they vowed that it should be an active defence. They were light on firepower, but very good in terms of mobility and lower-level tactics. The forest itself dictated a heavy emphasis on individual initiative and small unit operations, quasi-guerrilla style. Marksmanship, mental agility, woodcraft, orienteering, camouflage and physical fitness were stressed, and parade ground compliments were discouraged. Unconventional tactics, ambushes, long-range patrols, deceptions, raids were enshrined as doctrine and refined. The Finns intended to absorb the first Soviet strikes, delay the enemy, let him wear himself down, and then counterattack. Just after dawn on the 30th of November 1939, Russian SB-2 medium bombers attacked strategic points in Helsinki, killing 200 on the first day of the war. Over the next 48 hours, reports poured into Mannerheim's HQ of Soviet attacks from the Gulf of Finland in the south to the Arctic coast. In Finland's far north, elements of the White Sea Fleet bombarded Finn positions on the Raibachi Peninsula. Shortly afterwards, troops of the Soviet 104th Division stormed ashore. Faced with overwhelming odds, the Finns pulled back south along the Arctic Highway, abandoning the port of Petsamo. There was no alternative. Mannerheim knew that any attempt to hold the port would result in a siege, and he had no way of keeping the garrison supplied. On the 1st of December, the Soviet cruiser Kirov and 2 large destroyers opened fire on Finnish fortifications at Hanko on the Gulf of Finland. Finnish coastal batteries remained silent until the Russian ships were within range, and then loosed a salvo. They scored a direct hit on one of the destroyers, which put about abruptly and limped out of range behind a smokescreen. Finnish batteries then straddled Kirov, with at least one shell smashing into the engine room. Losing power rapidly, Kirov withdrew from action as fast as she could and was towed back to Kronstadt. On land, the Finns were doing less well. As Mannerheim thought, the main Soviet offensive thrust came up the Karelian Isthmus. It was here, on a front of some 80 kilometers, that Meretskov had concentrated 120,000 troops, supported by 1,000 tanks. Directly in front of the main defensive line, Mannerheim had created a buffer zone, some 20 to 45 kilometers deep, in which villages had been razed and booby-trapped, and mines had been planted. About 21,000 Finnish soldiers held strong points in this zone, their role to break up and disorganize Soviet formations before they reached the main defensive positions. In some places, this strategy worked. On the southwest coast, the Soviets ran into determined resistance before the village of Terijoki, where Finnish companies counterattacked during the night of the 30th of November, 1st of December, and succeeded in retaking lost positions. But elsewhere, Finnish forces abandoned positions, sometimes on the merest rumor that the Russians were approaching. On the 4th of December, a furious Mannerheim stormed into General Osterman's HQ, demanding that the forces in the buffer zone offer firmer resistance to the Soviet advance. Osterman, who regarded the buffer zone policy as too risky for Finland's semi-trained troops, offered his resignation, which Mannerheim refused to accept. Had the Soviets reached the Mannerheim line at this time, they may have triggered a major crisis in the Finnish ranks. But the Russians advanced sluggishly, their massive mechanized columns immobilized for hours at a time in huge traffic jams. It was not until the 6th of December that Soviet forward units reached the line, and not until the 8th of December that artillery and ammunition had been brought forward in significant quantities. By this time, Mannerheim was receiving alarming reports from all along Finland's 1,000-kilometer frontier with the USSR north of Lake Ladoga. A fairly developed road and rail system ran along the northern shore of the lake, and along this advanced 3 Soviet divisions, far more than Mannerheim had thought the Soviets could logistically sustain. Here, there was no defense line. The defending troops, Finland's 4th Corps, too weak to hold ground, had to rely on a mobile defense. Finnish sappers blew up a dam on Lake Sujärvi, about 16 kilometers northeast of Ladoga, which flooded the Soviets' main line of advance for a few hours before the water froze. On the 3rd of December, the Finns attempted a counterattack, but the sudden appearance of Russian tanks stopped them in their tracks. They disengaged hurriedly and withdrew to the western bank of the Aitujaki River. The next day, the Soviets crossed in strength, pushing the Finns back to the road junction at Tolvajärvi, from where it was possible that the Soviets might come around the north of Lake Ladoga and take the Mannerheim line from the rear. Further north still, the Soviet 163rd and 44th Divisions ground along tracks and logging roads towards the main north-south highway junction at Suomussalmi, a town with a peacetime population of about 4,000. So certain was Mannerheim that the Soviets would not be able to operate in such a remote area that he had deployed only a few companies of border guards. The Soviets pushed them aside with ease. On the 7th of December, Soviet columns rolled into the straggling streets of Suomussalmi. From here, the Soviets were poised to advance west across the narrow waste of Finland and cut the country in half. With the exception of a naval reversal off Hanko, the first week of operations had gone well for the Soviets. It seemed that another week would secure victory. They were so confident, they established a new government in one of the villages they had liberated in the Karelian Isthmus, a government which was sure to be in Helsinki in the very near future. In Helsinki, by the end of the first week, many members of the government and several quite senior soldiers were close to despair. A younger, less experienced commander might well have succumbed to panic. But this was Mannerheim's 5th war, and he reviewed the growing crisis with icy calm. He'd been surprised by the sheer extent of the Soviet thrusts, but he knew that so many over such long distances would stretch Soviet logistics. Although Finnish forces everywhere had been driven back, a Soviet breakthrough had not been achieved. Mannerheim took prompt action. The commanding officer of 4th Corps, who'd been unable to prevent a near disaster north of Lake Ladoga, he replaced with Major General Waldemar Haglund, a veteran of the 27th Jaegers. He also redeployed his scarce resources, sending reinforcements to 4th Corps north of Lake Ladoga and to Suomussalmi. But he kept most of his reserves concentrated on the Karelian Isthmus. Finland could afford to give ground anywhere but there. On the Karelian front, Meretskov knew that the Finns would concentrate their forces on the central west of the Mannerheim line at Sumer, where a developed road and rail system ran northwest to Viipuri and then on to Helsinki. So he decided to attack first on the Finns' eastern flank, near the village of Taipale, where the Mannerheim line met Lake Ladoga. Enough pressure here, Meretskov reasoned, would persuade the Finns to commit their reserves, at which point the Soviets would strike at Sumer. The first Russian probes crossed the Taipale River on the 6th of December and found the far bank apparently undefended. More battalions rushed forward to exploit what seemed to be a gap in the Mannerheim line. However, all was not as it seemed. The hapless Russians advanced into a carefully prepared killing ground, covered by Finnish artillery and machine guns. The first waves of Russians were cut down in a torrent of fire. To the amazement of the Finns, the Russians kept pouring units into what was clearly a trap. They failed to understand Meretskov's strategy, which was to accept high casualties in order to engage the Finns in an attritional battle and draw their strength away from Sumer. Before dawn on the 14th of December, massed Soviet artillery opened up its first major bombardment of the war. At 11:30, the barrage lifted. Soviet tanks, accompanied by infantry in closely packed groups, moved forward. The Finns waited until the Russians reached pre-plotted firing lines and then opened up. Shrapnel tore through the dense masses of Soviet infantry, while tank after tank was hit. It took just 5 minutes to bring the Soviet attack to a halt and then send it staggering into retreat. Meretskov fed another 2 divisions into the battle and reinforced the artillery to 84 batteries. Although he had hoped for a breakthrough, he believed that the fighting was now of such intensity that it must have absorbed the Finnish reserve. That being so, it was time to alter the axis of attack. At 0500 on the 17th of December, Meretskov launched his main offensive against the Mannerheim line at Sumy. Massed Soviet artillery opened up, and for 5 hours worked its way backwards and forwards across the Finnish positions. It was the heaviest artillery bombardment experienced anywhere in the world since those on the Western Front at the beginning of November 1918. Moving along corridors left untouched by the artillery, Soviet sappers swarmed forward, attempting to lift mines and clear obstacles. Behind them rumbled the tanks, accompanied at first by clumps of Russian infantry. But infantry and armor cooperation was poor. As the tanks pushed forward, the infantry were left behind, leaving gaps. Spotting their chance to exploit this weakness, Finnish machine gunners and mortar teams opened up on the infantry. The tanks rolled on alone to the line of granite anti-tank obstacles, their tracks biting into the rock monoliths and pushing the tanks skyward at a steep angle. At this point, the Finnish anti-tank teams struck. In some places, the crew of a Bofors 37mm anti-tank gun managed to get their solid 2-pound shells directly into the vulnerable bellies of the tanks, smashing the transmission or killing some of the crew. At many points in the Sumy sector, the Mannerheim line was flanked by lakes, which were now frozen solid. As his frontal assaults against the line ground to a halt, Meretskov sent columns directly across the lakes in the hope of outflanking the main defences. But the shores of the lakes were made up of jumbles of granite boulders, cliffs and dense forests. There were only a handful of exits from most lakes, which channeled the Russian advance. With carefully placed anti-tank guns and ambush parties, these exits were turned into killing grounds. By the 19th of December, Meretskov was becoming desperate. He had promised Stalin victory for his birthday on the 21st of December. While closely packed battalions were marched over minefields, clearing them with their own bodies, the KV tank was sent into action for the first time. A squadron of these 47-ton monsters managed to smash its way through part of the Mannerheim line and into the streets of the village of Sumy. But the threatened breakthrough was quickly sealed off. Finnish infantry swarmed over the roofs of the houses, jumped onto the tops of the tanks and fired their Sumis through the driver's vision slit, while others drenched the KVs with Molotov cocktails. On the 20th of December, Meretskov's armoured commanders reported that the assault on the Mannerheim line had cost 250 armoured vehicles, most of which had been lost in the fighting around Sumy. Casualties, too, had been horrific. As General Osterman surveyed the battlefield through his binoculars, the sight of dozens of burnt-out Soviet tanks and dark piles of dead Russian infantry convinced him that the time had come for a counterattack. Mannerheim was much more cautious, but he too seems to have been carried away by a new infectious spirit of optimism. At 06:30 on the 23rd of December, Finnish artillery opened up for a 10-minute barrage, behind which 3 Finnish divisions, the 1st, 4th and 6th, advanced towards the Russians. They overran Russian outposts with relative ease, but as they advanced, Russian resistance increased. Faced with an increasingly resolute Soviet defense, the Finnish divisions began to collapse into a huge, ungainly mob, unresponsive to the commands of the officers. Realizing that he had a first-class debacle on his hands, Mannerheim called off the attack. The Finns lost 1,500 men on the 23rd of December, a salutary reminder of the cost of such operations. Elsewhere, however, lightly equipped semi-trained Finnish forces were beginning to strike back at Soviet columns. In the forest vastness north of Lake Ladoga, battalions of white-clad ski troops could move rapidly around the flanks of Soviet columns, striking them from unexpected directions. From these guerrilla pinpricks, a series of increasingly impressive counterattacks began to emerge. They began immediately north of Ladoga, in the area of Tolvajavi and Ilomantsi. On Finnish Independence Day, the 6th of December, when Finnish fortunes seemed to hit rock bottom, Colonel Paavo Talvela, an old friend of Mannerheim's, reported to the Marshal's HQ at Mikkeli. Mannerheim was brief and to the point. All Finnish forces in the Tolvajavi-Ilomantsi corridor were henceforth designated Group Talvela. The colonel was to drive north and stabilize the situation. But this was easier said than done. When Talvela reached the front later that day, he found the Finns frightened, demoralized, and getting ready to retreat once again. Talvela realized that something had to be done quickly, in case the entire defense north of Ladoga collapsed. The best way of restoring their confidence, Talvela reasoned, was to give them a quick victory. Displaying a boldness that verged on the reckless, Talvela selected a few companies who seemed to be coping better than the rest, and just before midnight sent them across the ice of Lake Tolvajavi to raid Russian bivouacs. By 0200 on the 7th of December, 140 Finns, whose weapons included 16 light machine guns, lay spread out along a low ridge looking down into a Russian battalion, encamped around blazing fires. Rarely have troops been presented with such clear and easy targets. The Finns opened fire. A withering barrage cut through the Russian ranks for 4 minutes, reducing the clumps of men to forlorn heaps. When they stopped, there was no movement. The entire battalion had been wiped out. Russian units to the left and right flanks began firing wildly, and then at each other. The Finns slipped back across the ice to the sounds of an ever more ferocious battle, as the Russians killed each other. News of the success of the raid reinvigorated the Finns. The following day, on the 8th of December, a force operating to the north under Colonel Pa Elkholm ambushed and annihilated a Russian battalion as it attempted to find its way out of a frozen bog. With success like this, Talvela felt confident enough to order a general counterattack. For the next 2 days, the Finns kept attacking along the flanks of the strung-out Russian units. The temperature was now minus 25 degrees. The snowdrifts were deep and solid, and the Russians had no skis. As the Finns swept around them, the Russians tried to hit back with tactical airstrikes, which helped Soviet morale but had little chance of locating their well-camouflaged enemy. Late on the 21st of December, 2 companies of Finns crossed the ice of Lake Tolvajavi to attack the village of Olgajärvi from the north. 2 companies attacked from the south. The Russians had turned each building into a strong point, and every one had to be destroyed in turn with grenades, Molotov cocktails, and satchel charges. It was a bloody and exhausting business, but by 1400 hours the Russians were in retreat. The Finns pressed on for 2 more days, reaching the Aitojoki River on the 23rd of December, when Mannerheim called off the attack. Since the beginning of the offensive on the 7th of December, Talvela's force of 6,000 men had suffered 2,000 casualties, of whom 630 had been killed. The Finns counted more than 4,000 Russian bodies, and estimated that at least another 5,000 had been wounded, of whom some 600 had become prisoners. Further south, along the northern shore of Lake Ladoga, General Haglund launched a counter-offensive against the Soviet 168th Division, which was spread out along dozens of kilometers of snowbound road. As Finnish ski troops swept around the Russian flanks, chopping into the columns in elongated pockets, the Russian troops deployed for all-round defense and began digging in. By the second week in January, Russian columns had been cut into 11 pockets, known to the Finns as motis. Haglund barely had enough men to maintain a permanent presence at each moti, and instead conducted a mobile siege, with ski troops keeping the Russians off balance through a series of hit-and-run attacks. Most motis were too powerful to attack directly. They contained scores of tanks, hundreds of guns, and the men could survive for a time by eating their horses and by supply drops from the Soviet Air Force. The Finns set up anti-aircraft guns around the motties and sometimes succeeded in duplicating Russian signals requesting logistic drops, so that the supplies came floating down to their own rather than the Soviet positions. The Russians attempted to supplement the airdrop by bringing in supplies across Lake Ladoga at night, but these columns were frequently ambushed by Finnish ski patrols. As Soviet supplies dwindled, pocket after pocket was faced with the choice of surrendering to the Finns or attempting to break out. Invariably, they chose the latter course. The 3,600 Russians inside the East Lameti motti came charging out in mid-January, hoping to overwhelm the single battalion besieging them, but ran into withering machine gun fire. After the massacre, the Finns counted more than 3,000 Russian dead, including a Soviet general who was surrounded by the bodies of 4 female typists, each clutching a rifle. By the end of January, 8 of the 11 mottis along the northern shore of Lake Ladoga had fallen to General Haugland's forces. During December, the news from Finland had been greeted in the Kremlin with disquiet, then alarm, and finally rage. In late December, Stalin met with his military chiefs. The Soviet leader was painfully aware that the world was comparing his own failure to defeat Finland with Hitler's rapid destruction of Poland 3 months earlier. He ordered the execution of some of the officers who had failed, but there was to be no wholesale bloodletting. Stalin knew that the poor performance of the Soviet army was partly due to his own purge of senior and middle-ranking officers. He was a survivor, and his response to the crisis was pragmatic. The Leningrad military district that had been conducting the campaign was reorganized and became the Northwestern Army Group, or Front. To command at the operational level, Stalin chose General Semyon Konstantinovich Timoshenko, a former barrel maker, who had proved an effective army commander in the short Polish campaign. Timoshenko's first step was to reorganize the Northwestern Front, creating 2 armies, 7th and 14th. Once he established a new command structure, he moved in fresh divisions. Like Meretskov before him, he identified a 16-kilometer wide corridor at Sumy as the best place to effect a breakthrough. Here, he assembled 10 infantry divisions, 5 tank brigades, and 2,800 guns, enough artillery to give him a front-wide ratio of 50 guns per kilometer. During the last weeks of January, Soviet patrols probed the Mannerheim line, identifying the location of bunkers, and even bringing back pieces of concrete for analysis. On the 1st of February, Northwestern Front's artillery opened up, pumping 300,000 shells into Finnish positions in the first 24 hours. In the Sumy sector alone, 400 shells per minute rained on Finnish positions. Under this crushing bombardment, some of the Finnish fortifications began to crumble. Behind the bombardment, shock troops of the 123rd Division skirmished forward to clear corridors through the barbed wire, the minefields, and the anti-tank obstacles to the main defences. Not all the bunkers were mutually supporting, and some isolated positions fell to the Russians, although the Finns almost always counterattacked and recaptured them. By the 10th of February, the Soviets were attacking all along the line, forcing the Finns into a battle of attrition they could not win. To the alarm of the defenders, Finnish batteries were no longer responding to Russian shelling. The Finns were running out of ammunition, and battery commanders were now under strict orders not to fire except in cases of dire emergency. Finnish soldiers watched with frustration as masses of Russian infantry deployed to their front, and their guns remained silent. They now had to rely on machine guns, rifles and mortars to prevent a breakthrough. But still, the Mannerheim line held. The Russians attempted to outflank the line by sending columns across the ice of the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. Finnish coastal batteries sent armor-piercing shells smashing into the frozen surface. airbursts of shrapnel tore through the Soviet ranks, pushing them to flee across the fractured ice, where many hundreds drowned. On the 12th of February, a thick fog blanketed the Gulf of Finland. The Russians, advancing under its cover, got to within 50 meters of the Finnish shore when the fog lifted and the defenders' machine guns cut them down in heaps. The Finns still had astonishing successes, but Soviet numbers began to tell. By the second week in February, Finnish reinforcements consisted mainly of 16-year-old boys and reservists in their mid-50s. On the 14th of February, casualties in the Suma sector reached crisis point, and Mannerheim authorized a withdrawal. But with Suma gone, the remainder of the front was no longer viable. At 1600 hours on the 15th of February, Mannerheim ordered a general retreat back to an intermediate line, which was much less fortified. It took the Soviets 72 hours to close up. By the 18th of February, positions along the intermediate line were coming under increasing pressure. Finnish aerial reconnaissance and radio intercepts revealed that the Soviets were moving up artillery and vast stores of ammunition in preparation for another massive bombardment. Because the defences of the intermediate position were much less strong than those of the Mannerheim line, the Marshal could see no good reason to leave his troops in a position where they would be slaughtered. Between the 27th and 28th of February, the Finns withdrew to a third position, the reserve line, so that Timoshenko's shells crashed down on empty trenches. Mannerheim had saved his army, but it was now at its last defense line. By the 2nd of March, Timoshenko had 30 divisions, supported by at least 1,200 tanks and other armored vehicles, and 2,000 aircraft poised to smash the Finns. A day later, wave upon wave of men and machines of Soviet 28th Corps attacked across the ice of the Gulf of Finland. They suffered huge casualties from artillery and air attack, but managed to establish two small beachheads to the west of Viipuri, thus outflanking the Finns' last defense line. Mannerheim, who was now severely ill with flu, knew that any delay in evacuating Viipuri might prove fatal. But he also knew that if he could hold out until the thaw, perhaps only a week away, Russian guns and tanks would sink into a morass. There were only two things which could save Finland: the spring and the intervention of foreign powers, particularly Britain and France. Unfortunately, the winter of 1939-40 was one of the coldest and longest of the 20th century. Foreign intervention was proving as illusory as the spring. Some foreign help had arrived, but it was in the form of semi-trained companies and battalions of idealistic volunteers, mainly from Sweden, but with contingents from many other European countries and the United States. On the 29th of February, Finnish diplomats had been on the point of accepting new Russian demands when an urgent message arrived from Paris. The French government urged Finland to fight on and promised the immediate dispatch of 50,000 troops and 100 bombers. On the strength of this promise, the Finns rejected Moscow's offer. But the French offer was dependent on the cooperation of Great Britain, and while Britain wished to send forces to Norway and Sweden to interfere with Germany's supplies of iron ore, London was not necessarily interested in going to Finland to fight the Russians. In addition, any Anglo-French intervention force destined for Finland was going to have to get the permission of the Norwegian and Swedish governments to cross their territory, and this was something Oslo and Stockholm were not prepared to allow. Like the prospect of the thaw, the promise of foreign intervention caused the Finns to hang on beyond the 11th hour. On the night of the 7th and 8th of March, the Russians expanded their beachhead on the Gulf coast, bringing their artillery within range of the Viipuri-Helsinki highway. The Finnish 23rd Division fell to pieces. One battalion threw down its weapons and fled to the west, while other battalions refused to counterattack. 2 days later, Finland made a desperate appeal to Norway and Sweden to open their borders, knowing that the appeal would be rejected. Finnish diplomats had already decided they had no choice other than to accede to Russian demands, and on the 13th of March signed a ceasefire in Moscow, which gave Stalin everything he had wanted. The Russo-Finnish War had lasted just 105 days. Finland had lost 25,000 dead and 43,500 wounded, out of a total population of fewer than 4 million. The Soviet losses were much greater, at least 250,000 dead, and about the same number wounded. The Finns took 5,000 Russian prisoners, a surprisingly low number that says much about the severity of the fighting. Though Finland had had to bow to the inevitable, she had earned a reputation as a formidable small power, a nation not to be meddled with. Conversely, even though the Soviets eventually succeeded, the reputation of the Soviet army as a fighting force had been destroyed. American and British observers rated the USSR as a third-rate military power, a hapless giant incapable of defending itself. So too did the Germans. In fact, in April 1940, the Supreme Military Soviet met to sift through the lessons of the war and push through a program of radical reform. It was just in time. At 11 a.m. on the 3rd of September 1939, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced that a state of war existed between Germany and Great Britain. That evening, the Donaldson liner SS Athenia sailed 250 miles northwest of the Irish coast on her normal routine passage from Glasgow to Montreal. She was carrying 1,103 passengers and a crew of 305. Amongst her passengers were 300 Americans, as well as over 100 children. At 7:30 p.m., her port side exploded. Athenia immediately listed to port and began to settle by the stern. Although she remained afloat for several hours before she finally sank, 118 passengers and crew were killed, including 28 Americans. The Athenia had been sunk by a U-30 commanded by Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp. It was an unprecedented act of naval aggression. The Battle of the Atlantic and the war against the U-boats had begun. From the Middle Ages, Britain depended on overseas trade for her wealth and prosperity. She established and expanded an overseas empire whose role was to supply raw materials and act as a market for British manufactured goods. But Britain had become more and more vulnerable to interruptions to that trade. Almost half the world's ocean-going merchant shipping flew the Red Ensign. British shipyards built 40% of the world's merchant ships, and the Royal Navy made protecting Britain's trade vessels one of its top priorities. Needless to say, Britain's enemies recognized that interrupting her trade would have disastrous consequences. Between 1914 and 1918, Germany pursued a submarine campaign against the United Kingdom that nearly brought Britain to her knees. In April 1917, the Germans sank almost 900,000 tons of Allied shipping, virtually all of which was by submarine. It was a catastrophic loss, reducing the British stock of essential war supplies down to a mere 6 weeks. Yet the submarines involved were small, fragile, and unreliable. The first German submarine, the U-1, had only been completed at the end of 1906, and the first operational U-boat, armed with a single torpedo tube, had managed to complete a 600-mile cruise around German waters in 1908. To the British, the idea of a submarine was looked on as ignoble and underhand. In 1914, Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, dismissed the possibility of a submarine campaign targeting Britain's trade. "I do not believe that this would ever be undertaken by a civilized power," he said. Lusitania was on a normal liner voyage from New York to Liverpool when, as she approached Queenstown on the Irish coast, she was hit by a torpedo fired from a U-20. She sank rapidly, taking almost 2,000 passengers with her, most of whom were women and children. Over 100 were Americans. The Germans quickly tried to justify the act by claiming that the Lusitania was carrying war supplies. Although there was a shred of truth to such claims, the loss of so much innocent life could not be justified. The loss of the Lusitania raised the curtain on unrestricted submarine warfare. All enemy vessels became legitimate targets and could be attacked without warning. Gradually, the British Admiralty began to realize that the submarine could completely change maritime warfare. German submarines started to seriously weaken British and Allied shipping, and the defenders had little with which to fight back. Tactics like Q-ships, where warships were disguised as merchant ships, simply forced the German submarines to attack while still submerged. Only the reluctant introduction of the convoy system late in the war led to a decline in the numbers of lost merchant ships. By the end of the First World War, almost 5,000 British merchant ships were sunk by submarines. Nearly 15,500 merchant sailors were lost. At the same time, 178 German submarines were sunk, killing over 6,000 German sailors. But they had brought Britain perilously close to defeat. It was a salutary lesson on the potential of the submarine as a devastating weapon. This lesson was lost neither on the British nor on those surviving German naval officers who would later spearhead the naval forces in the Second World War. The Treaty of Versailles placed strict limits on the size and the composition of the German armed forces. One of these limits imposed a total ban on the construction or operation of submarines. But Germany had entered the First World War as submarine novices and emerged from it as experts. Small as it was, the German Navy was not about to throw away its huge advantage in an area of warfare that would prove critical in any future conflict. The result was a remarkable conspiracy by German naval officers and shipbuilders, in which a web of intrigue was created to mask the fact that Germany was determined to build on its expertise in submarine warfare. As early as 1920, a new underwater warfare section was established within the Torpedo and Mines Inspectorate at Kiel. At the same time, German shipbuilders could still offer help and advice to countries such as Japan, Argentina, Italy, and Sweden. This ingenious plan ensured that German skills were not lost and were kept up to date with new technological developments. Germany even tried to establish submarine building yards in Holland and Spain. These plans were soon shelved, though, after pressure from the international community. Other complicated cover organizations were established to make it virtually impossible for Allied monitors, set up under the League of Nations, to keep accurate records of what the Germans were really up to. By the early 1930s, German-designed submarines were under construction in Holland, Spain, Estonia, and Finland for a variety of customers. Strangely enough, every submarine looked remarkably similar to the most successful German U-boat designs of the First World War. When Adolf Hitler took power in 1932, rearmament took on a new importance. Hitler was determined to remove the restrictions that had been imposed at Versailles as soon as he could, by legal means or not. By the autumn of 1933, an official submarine school was established at Kiel, and 80 officers were hand-picked to become its first students. At the same time, U-boat parts and sections began to be imported into Germany from the German-sponsored submarine yards in Holland. By 1935, Hitler was proposing a new German navy that was to include a submarine force nearly half the size of that of Great Britain. Unfortunately, by this time the restrictions imposed by Versailles and other naval treaties had been flouted by almost all the signatories, leaving Britain with little choice but to accept the new German proposals. The world, however, was somewhat surprised to find that Germany was starting to commission brand new submarines only 4 months after she had agreed to relax the limitations. But it was too late. By September 1939, Germany boasted 57 U-boats. Traditionally, Britain's ports had specific roles. On the east coast, Hull was the main trading port for northern Europe, Scandinavia and the Baltic. Newcastle was a coal-exporting port, and London was the most important port for the imperial trade with East Africa and the Far East, with the ships of the British India Line, the Orient Line and P&O largely based there. Southampton on the south coast was mainly a passenger port for services to North America. The great Cunard White Star liners, including the Queen Mary, Aquitania, Mauretania, and the almost complete Queen Elizabeth, started their record-breaking voyages from the port. On the west coast, the major ports for North America were Liverpool and Birkenhead. Manchester was home to Cunard's cargo operation, and the company's Port Line, Harrison Line, and the Blue Star Line. Trade with South America was conducted via the Bristol Channel ports. With war looming on the horizon, this pattern of trade had to change. A shift took place away from the more vulnerable ports of the south and east towards the ports of the west and north that were further from the enemy. Similarly, the traditional naval bases of Plymouth, Portsmouth and Chatham were just too close to Germany. So the escorts followed the merchant ships to the north and west, with the major units moving to bases in Scotland. To have a serious effect on Britain's trade with her empire and with her North American partners, the U-boats would have to operate in the western approaches, either north of Ireland into the Clyde or through St. George's Channel into the Irish Sea and Liverpool. These waters had proved rich grounds for the U-boats of the Kaiser's navy, and the first successes of the German submarines had been achieved west of Ireland. It would be some time before U-boats in sufficient numbers were available to take the war further afield. It would also be in this region that the Royal Navy initially deployed its meagre anti-submarine forces. The Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy through most of the Battle of the Atlantic was Admiral of the Fleet Sir Dudley Pound. As First Sea Lord, he was responsible for all the operational and administrative aspects of the British Navy. He was appointed to the job at the age of 62 in June 1939, having been Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean. In some respects, though, he was an odd choice. He suffered from arthritis in his left leg that disturbed his sleep and gave him a pronounced limp. Although this disability never affected his judgment, it did account for certain aspects of his personality. He lacked humor, had no interests outside his work, and he found delegation difficult. Some of his colleagues believed him to be a pressure cooker, barely under control. But his long experience as a naval officer that included the Battle of Jutland and a first-class brain enabled him to cope with the stresses and strains of working with Winston Churchill. He had the courage to resist some of Churchill's wilder naval schemes, helping the war effort considerably. Once he was left in peace to conduct a purely naval operation from the Admiralty, Pound showed sound personal judgment and a readiness to take responsibility for fateful decisions. He was correct more often than he was proved wrong. Certainly no one could criticize Pound's devotion to his duty and the cause for which he was fighting. Admiral Sir Max Houghton is the British naval officer whose name is most synonymous with the victory of the Battle of the Atlantic. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches on the 19th of November 1942 and bore that responsibility until the end of the war. Houghton was the third officer to hold the post. The first had been a hero of the First World War, Admiral Sir Martin Dunbar-Naismith, who had earned the Victoria Cross for his exploits as a submarine commander in the Mediterranean. Dunbar-Naismith's problems had been huge, and he should take the credit for establishing the first escort groups and a training regime to enable escort crews to approach their task in the most professional manner possible. He formed a tactical training school at Liverpool for escort officers and a work-up facility at Tobermory on the Isle of Mull, where ships could practice their tactics under the watchful eye of the notorious Vice Admiral Gilbert Stevenson, the terror of Tobermory. Dunbar-Naismith was also responsible for the relocation of the Western Approaches HQ from Plymouth to Derby House in Liverpool, where it was much closer to the heart of the battle. It was shortly after this move, on the 17th of February 1941, that he was relieved as Commander-in-Chief by Admiral Sir Percy Noble. Dunbar-Naismith remained as Commander-in-Chief of the Plymouth Command. Admiral Noble was an agile, clever and popular officer, known for his fastidious dress and cleanliness. But apart from his personal eccentricities, Noble was responsible for much of the victory his command eventually achieved over the German U-boats. In particular, he devoted much effort to improving cooperation between the Royal Navy and Coastal Command of the Royal Air Force, in which he was ably assisted by the then Commander-in-Chief Coastal Command, Air Vice Marshal J.M. Robb. This essential inter-service partnership was enhanced with the transfer of operational control of Coastal Command from the RAF to the Admiralty on the 15th of April 1941. The possibility of transferring Coastal Command bodily to the Navy was considered, but rejected for bureaucratic reasons. In his efforts to improve relations and operational compatibility between the Americans, Canadians and the British, Noble had some success. To enable him to continue with this part of his task, he was relieved as Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches on the 19th of November 1942 and appointed as head of the British Naval Mission in Washington. He was replaced by Admiral Sir Max Houghton, who was until then Flag Officer Submarines. Houghton, a much more flamboyant figure than Noble, had been handed the blueprint for victory. He looked young for his 60 years and had been a submariner from the beginnings of his naval career. After joining the Royal Navy's submarine service in 1904, he commanded his first boat a year later. He served in submarines throughout the First World War and gained distinction by being the first British submarine commander to sink a German warship. To mark this victory, he introduced the custom of flying the skull and crossbones on return from a successful patrol, a custom still practiced in the Royal Navy today. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Houghton was the Vice Admiral in command of the Reserve Fleet and was briefly in command of the Northern Patrol until Churchill appointed him head of the Navy's submarine arm. Once given command of the Western Approaches, Houghton became the archetypal poacher-turned-gamekeeper. Houghton's reputation for decisive leadership earned him the job, as well as the fact that he had more knowledge of submarine operations than any other officer on the Allied side. As Flag Officer Submarines, most of his effort had been devoted to the running of the Royal Navy's small and widely scattered submarine force. Now he had to turn his talents and enthusiasm to a strategic situation. His abrasive style soon earned him the nickname of Fire Eater among his subordinates. Further down the line, he was described in rather less respectful terms. He could be dealt with in one of two ways, either by complete submission or a resistance based on superior knowledge. But to resist Houghton required courage and confidence. Few possessed this, one of them being his intelligence advisor, Commander Roger Wynne, head of the submarine tracking room. After what could be described as a frank exchange of views during which Houghton accused Wynne of incompetence, Wynne took Admiral Houghton down to the intelligence cell, showed him all the information available, and asked for Houghton's advice on how to handle it. Houghton, having studied the mass of information for a few minutes, gave in. "Well, I think this is a bit outside my field. It's yours, Roger." This is as close as Horton ever got to conceding a position, and was the basis for a mutual trust between him and Commander Wynne for the rest of the war. Admiral Ernest King was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy in December 1941. In March of the following year, he combined this post with that of Chief of Naval Operations, becoming not only the administrative head of the U.S. Navy, but also its operational commander. After the Senate confirmed him in the post for 4 years, he remained in the position for the duration of the war. In some respects, he was a strange choice. King was a true Anglophobe. He detested almost everything British. For Roosevelt to appoint him to a position where close relationships with the British would determine the success of the Atlantic campaign seemed almost deliberately provocative on the president's part. At the high command level, General George Marshall, President Roosevelt's chief of staff, was almost the complete opposite. His regard for the British was high, and his relations with Churchill and most British commanders were good. So, to some extent, Marshall's presence compensated for King's influence. Ernest King was born in Lorain, Ohio, in 1878, and was old enough to have served in the Spanish-American War of 1898. He served in a wide variety of posts and built up experience in gunnery, torpedo boats, mining operations, and submarines. King also commanded ships and squadrons, as was the normal career pattern for senior naval officers at the time. Unlike some of his British colleagues during the Atlantic campaign, he was willing to listen to subordinates and to absorb their ideas, although in doing so he often displayed a rudeness that earned him respect but not affection in the service. King was appointed Chief of the Naval Bureau of Aeronautics in 1933, and was largely responsible for the U.S. Navy's development of naval aviation that was far in advance of anything comparable in the Royal Navy. He rose through the positions of aircraft commander in the battle fleet to commander of the U.S. Navy's patrol force. In this post, he became deeply involved in the U.S. Navy's increasing commitment to the Atlantic, and became highly involved personally in the way the battle against the U-boats was being conducted. This may be the cause of his constant interference and involvement in the Atlantic theatre of operations, that contrasted with his attitude to the Pacific War. In the Pacific, King chose senior officers he believed he could trust, such as Chester Nimitz, and let them get on with the job. In the Atlantic, King took personal command. Grand Admiral Erich Rieder was Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, from the beginning of the war to his resignation in 1943. He was at the helm for most of the critical period of the Battle of the Atlantic. Rieder had joined the German Navy in 1894, at the age of 18. A native of Hamburg, he'd served in the High Seas Fleet, commanding a cruiser, before his appointment as Chief of Staff to Admiral Hipper, who commanded the battle cruisers at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Rieder was a committed conservative and German nationalist who strongly believed the Navy could play a pivotal role in restoring Germany's position and greatness during the interwar period. In 1925 he was given command of the Baltic Naval Station, and in 1928 was appointed to the post of Chief of the Naval Command. Under Rieder, the German Navy was transformed. He conceived the so-called pocket battleships, designed to get around the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. He also lay at the heart of the subterfuge that led to Germany having a fully trained and experienced submarine arm, well before the ban on German possession of submarines was revoked. Rieder also masterminded the Z Plan, in which Germany was to build a large, well-equipped fleet based on modern battleships, battlecruisers, and aircraft carriers. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Second World War came 10 years before the plan could reach fruition. Rieder realized that the main role the German Navy could play in the conflict would be the same as in World War I, disrupting enemy trade. The importance of the submarine would be critical. Rieder needed the right man for the job, so Karl Dönitz was made commander of the submarine arm. It was Rieder who urged the German High Command to introduce unrestricted submarine warfare from the beginning of the Second World War. He remembered and had learned how close such a campaign came to success in early 1917. But Hitler equally remembered how the campaign had affected neutral opinion, especially in the United States. Admiral Reeder believed the surface fleet could play an almost equally vital role, and in the early days of the war he sent the few surface warships Germany had into the Atlantic, where they enjoyed limited success. Following the loss of the Bismarck in May 1941, the major surface units of the German Navy were restricted to operations around Norway and in the Baltic. It was his continuing belief in the part the surface warship could play that led to Reeder's downfall. On the 30th of December 1942, a force of German warships, including the pocket battleship Scheer and the heavy cruiser Hipper, sailed from Altenfjord in northern Norway to intercept an Allied convoy bound for Russia. In the ensuing chaos, the German ships were beaten off by a force of British cruisers and destroyers in the Battle of the Barents Sea. This humiliation, which was partly caused by Hitler's lack of resolve on committing surface ships to action, led the Führer to order the scrapping of all the remaining surface ships. Hitler's refusal to countermand this order triggered Reeder's resignation. In an ironic twist, he was replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Karl Dönitz. More than any other leader, Karl Dönitz epitomizes the Battle of the Atlantic. Dönitz was the Commander-in-Chief of the German submarine force from its formation until his promotion to Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy in early 1943. Even then, he maintained a firm hand on his beloved U-boats, only surrendering control in name. He achieved even greater notoriety as the second Führer of National Socialist Germany after Hitler's death. It had always been intended that Dönitz should take control of the newly formed U-boat force. At the time of its formation in February 1935, Dönitz was the captain of the cruiser Emden. He was 43 years old. Born near Berlin in 1891, he joined the Imperial Navy as a cadet in 1910, graduating as an officer in 1913. When the First World War broke out, he was signals officer of the cruiser Breslau, which was operating in the Mediterranean at the time. In 1916, Dönitz was appointed to the submarine service. After serving with distinction in U-39, he was given command of UC-25 at the beginning of 1918. His reports spoke of his fine military bearing, energy, good manners, diligence, enthusiasm, popularity, and tact with both officers and men. In late 1918, Dönitz was in command of UB-68. While attacking a British convoy in October, he was forced to scuttle his submarine and surrender. His captors noted that he was sullen and introspective. He became obsessed with the loss of his ship. After undergoing psychological examination in Britain, he was repatriated soon after the armistice, but he immediately rejoined the German Navy. Dönitz survived the post-war purge of naval officers which followed the Kaputsch and decided to stay in the Navy. After 2 years as a torpedo boat commander, Dönitz joined the Torpedo and Mine Inspectorate. After a series of sea and staff jobs, he was promoted steadily until he was considered the most appropriate officer to command the new submarine force. On the 1st of October 1935, he was promoted to full captain and appointed Chief of Submarines. Germany could boast 3 small submarines at the time. He worked closely with Admiral Reeder as the new Navy began to take shape and proposed that Reeder should include 300 submarines in his Z plan. This was the minimum number Dönitz felt would be viable for any forthcoming war with Great Britain. Reeder accepted the figure. At the end of the summer of 1939, Dönitz wrote to Reeder formally expressing his fears over a war with Britain when his force was so unprepared. But he was assured by Hitler himself that no such situation would be allowed to happen. Throughout the war, Dönitz maintained a tight control over his submarines. On the fall of France, he transferred his headquarters to Brittany, where he could be closer to the front line. He was always available to welcome returning crews and maintained a high public relations profile. This was part of his campaign to keep the German people constantly informed of the successes of the U-boats, and thus secure enough resources for the force to keep expanding. This was not always easy. he found himself in constant conflict with the German Navy's biggest enemy, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe. As the war continued, Dönitz constantly developed his concept of operations to reflect the strategic changes taking place. As more U-boats became available, he identified vulnerable areas in the Allied convoy routes and targeted his forces there accordingly. As numbers increased, he introduced the Wolfpack tactics. Although he claimed they were his own invention, he had in fact learned them from his experiences in the First World War. But he certainly enhanced their operations to the point where they almost defeated Allied defensive measures. Yet Dönitz was a realist. He knew that to win the Battle of the Atlantic, his submarines had to sink Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. When in the middle of 1943, he realized that he was losing this battle, he knew that the U-boat campaign was doomed to failure. He did not give up and insisted that more and more resources be allocated to the submarine service. Despite his being the second and last Führer, albeit for only a few days, long enough to sign the German surrender, it was with some reluctance that the Allies put him on trial as a war criminal. The Battle of the Atlantic had mostly been fought within the rules of war, with few breaches of the rules on both sides. However, the sinking of the liner Laconia in September 1942 prompted Dönitz to change the rules concerning aid to survivors. U-boats were not put at risk. The Laconia had been carrying Italian prisoners of war, and a number of U-boats came under attack from Allied aircraft when they were trying to assist the survivors. Following this, Dönitz ordered his commanders not to render assistance and not to pick up survivors except when they could be of use to the submarine or to Germany. U-boat captains were, in his words, to be severe. Remember, he continued, that in his bombing raids on German cities, the enemy has no regard for women and children. This position was in clear breach of the London Protocol of 1936 and led to Dönitz being charged with war crimes. At Nuremberg, the prosecution said that this meant in practice an order to kill survivors. Dönitz argued that putting the safety of the submarine first was the main responsibility of the commanding officer. One of the witnesses for the defense was the Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz told the tribunal that American submarines in the Pacific had virtually the same orders as Dönitz had issued. Dönitz was convicted on a much lesser charge and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He died in 1980. On the outbreak of war, the Royal Navy had few ships capable of escorting convoys. The fleet was based upon some 20 major warships deployed around the world, policing the British Empire and the trade routes which maintained that empire. The resources which had gone into developing dedicated, purpose-built anti-submarine escorts for use in the North Atlantic were largely confined to giving destroyers and sloops a rudimentary fit of basic underwater submarine detection equipment and a few depth charge racks. Surface ships could detect submarines underwater by using two methods. Firstly, hydrophones lowered under the water might hear the noises made by U-boats' engines or propellers, but the submarine had to be very close for this to be effective. Today, this is known as passive sonar. Ships were able to detect submarines using crude hydrophones as early as 1918. The more advanced method was to mount an ASDIC transmitter on the bottom of the ship. ASDIC stood for Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, named after a group who looked into the problem in the 1930s. The ASDIC sent out a wave of sound which would rebound off the hull of a submarine. The transmitter then became a receiver which listened for the returning sound wave or echo. This is known today as active sonar. In 1939, the effective ASDIC range was about a mile. By the end of the war, better ASDIC sets were finding submarines well beyond this range. The sinking of the Athenia and other vulnerable merchant ships in the early days of the war caused the Admiralty to examine its position. Even then, the Royal Navy was more concerned about the threat from Germany's few surface ships than it was of submarines, and important convoys were often allocated an old battleship to scare off the Germans. When the convoy system was introduced, its escort might consist of a couple of old First World War destroyers for the last few hundred miles into a British port. Further west than 12 degrees, the convoy would be lucky to have any escort at all. And even if it did, the protection offered by a converted merchant ship with a few old 6-inch guns was minimal. Gradually, efforts were made to address the situation. Existing destroyers and sloops were given an enhanced anti-submarine capability. More suitable merchant ships, particularly large trawlers, were converted to ASW vessels and deployed on coastal work. Following agreements between the United States and Great Britain, 40 obsolete American destroyers were transferred to the Royal Navy, given a quick conversion, and deployed as escorts under the White Ensign. The main task, however, was to find a type of warship dedicated to anti-submarine operations that was cheap, quick, and easy to build in small shipyards, and needed only a small crew to operate it. The answer was in Middlesbrough. Smith's Dock Limited had come up with the idea of such an escort vessel based on their whale catcher Southern Pride. The design was to be a little larger than the whaler, but still small at only just over 1,000 tons. It would need a crew of about 100, had a steam reciprocating engine driving one propeller, which would give it a speed of 16 knots. It carried one 4-inch gun, plus a few smaller anti-aircraft guns, but it had a good ASDIC set and could carry up to 70 depth charges. The Flower-class corvettes, as they became known, were hideous vessels to serve in due to their dreadful seakeeping qualities, but they were ideal for the situation and became immortalized as the fictional corvette Compass Rose in the book and film The Cruel Sea. The Flower-class and their successors, the Castles, plugged the gap until something better came along. Once America had joined the war and her massive production capability was working, the Americans lent Britain a number of their destroyer escorts, smaller versions of their destroyers, but better for convoy escort. Britain built her own equivalent, the Hunt class. More importantly, in Britain, the corvette concept was enlarged, given better engines with 2 propellers, increasing the speed to 21 knots, a heavier armament, and a depth charge capacity of 150. Thus, the modern frigate was born. Even so, corvette construction still kept the smaller shipyards busy until the end of the war. Large trawlers and minesweepers were also built, which had a secondary anti-submarine escort role, and older destroyers were converted to escorts as new classes of modern destroyers entered the fleet. By 1942, it was apparent to British and American commanders that the key to success in the Battle of the Atlantic was the aircraft. German U-boats were potent weapons, but they were vulnerable to surprise air attack, either when they were shadowing a convoy or when they were on passage to or from their bases in western France. This became even more crucial when aircraft were equipped with radars that could identify a target many miles away, and when the target could be physically illuminated at night with the use of the Lee light. This was a large searchlight mounted under an aircraft, which could be switched on at the start of an attack. Not only did it give the attacker a better sight of the submarine, it also blinded the crew of the U-boat in the vital moments before they could respond. But the problem was always range. The Atlantic was a huge battlefield, and aircraft of this period did not have the endurance to cover it all. The air gap between Newfoundland, Iceland, and the west coast of Britain was always important, and the closing of the gap with aircraft was pivotal to the outcome of the battle. So an urgent priority was given to the acquisition of suitable aircraft. These could either be deployed from ships within the convoy or from strategically located land bases. It was to this end that the Allies occupied Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroes, but other bases which could have been useful, like the Azores or Ireland, were denied because of their owners' neutrality. Once the bases were found, then suitable aircraft had to be selected. Britain had considerable pre-war experience of the flying boat, and their versatility was useful especially in the early stages of the battle. The short Sunderland and the consolidated Catalina proved especially effective.
Night and day, the Sunderland flying boats patrol far out to eastward, keeping the German coast under constant surveillance for any sign of unwanted activity.
But the ideal long-range maritime patrol aircraft would have to be based on a bomber design. And such aircraft were hard to find, especially as RAF Bomber Command and the US Air Force jealously guarded the aircraft they had. The constant demands of Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris for his strategic bombing campaign over Germany were such that coastal command of the RAF had to be satisfied with those bombers such as the Wellington, whose bombing role had been taken over by the Avro Lancaster. One aircraft, however, was to have a huge impact on this aspect of the campaign. The consolidated B-24 Liberator had a range of over 2,500 miles, and with long-range fuel tanks added, it could remain airborne for up to 18 hours. It was useful as a bomber, which led to a tug-of-war between bomber and coastal commands once the latter appreciated its potential in the war against the U-boat. Those aircraft which were allocated to coastal command soon proved their worth, as they enabled shore-based air cover to be maintained almost all the way across the North Atlantic. To enable some sort of air cover to be maintained out of range of land-based aircraft, the Allies had to rely on aircraft carried by ships. As fleet aircraft carriers were in short supply and were often needed elsewhere, alternative and cheaper ways of providing that cover had to be found. Initially, a number of cargo ships were equipped with catapults that supported one Hurricane fighter. The role of this CAM, or catapult aircraft merchantman, however, was not anti-submarine operations. It was to shoot down the German Condor reconnaissance bomber, which was a significant threat to convoys as they approached the United Kingdom. The CAM ships were also used extensively on the Arctic convoys. Their main disadvantage was that the aircraft could not be reused, as it had to ditch at the end of its sortie. A further development of this was the Merchant Aircraft Carrier, or MAC, that was a bulk carrier, a tanker or grain ship, with a wooden flat deck built along its length above the hull. This deck meant that the MAC could continue to carry its cargo, but could also launch and recover a small number of aircraft, usually swordfish or albacores. These aircraft, although unsuitable for other duties, were ideal for short-range anti-submarine operations. The final development along these lines was the dedicated escort aircraft carrier. These were either built from scratch or converted from existing hulls. Almost all were built in the United States, and they served not only as anti-submarine carriers, but also as support fleet carriers, largely in the Pacific. One of these could provide almost permanent air cover for a convoy, its only serious limitation being the weather. It could carry up to 30 aircraft, including both fighters and anti-submarine aircraft such as the Grumman Avenger. The first German submarines, or U-boats, were based on designs which bore a striking resemblance to the UB-2 type submarines introduced by the Germans near the end of the First World War. The Type 1A was a medium-sized boat of 600 tons, based on a submarine being built for Turkey. Only 2 were constructed, and they were relegated to training duties on the outbreak of hostilities. The Type 2A was a small coastal submarine. Although 6 were built, their part in the war was also very restricted, mainly due to their range of only just over 1,000 miles. The Types 2B, C, and D were modifications of this design. Again, their relatively small size of about 300 tons limited their wartime activity considerably. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought by 2 main types of U-boat, the medium-range Type 7 and the long-range Type 9, with production concentrated on these 2. Both had been designed in the mid-1930s, yet were not surpassed until the latter stages of the war. The Type 7 had a displacement of some 700 tons, although later variants reached almost 1,000. They were 220 feet long and equipped with 5 21-inch torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 1 aft. Altogether, they carried 14 torpedoes, or mines. Using their diesel engines on the surface, they boasted a radius of action of some 6,500 miles, although the Type 7C-42 and other later versions could manage almost 10,000 miles. Submerged using batteries, the Type 7 could manage about 80 miles at 4 knots. They carried a crew of 44, and if necessary, could dive to about 650 feet. The Type 9 were somewhat larger, with earlier versions displacing just over 1,000 tons, growing to 1,600 tons with the Type 9 D2. Early versions had a radius of over 8,000 miles, growing to 11,000 miles as the design evolved. They could carry up to 22 torpedoes or mines for their 6 torpedo tubes, 4 of which were in the bow and 2 located in the stern. They carried crews of about 55. Both classes could remain submerged for about 24 hours. After that, they would have to surface to recharge their batteries and replace the stale air inside the U-boat. Both types carried a deck gun armament, mainly for use against merchant ships, but later they were used more for self-defense when the submarines were caught on the surface by aircraft. As this possibility became increasingly common, more anti-aircraft guns were added. The larger gun carried on the foredeck was a 3.5-inch on the Type 7 or a 4-inch on the Type 9. A variety of 2 or 3 37mm and 20mm guns constituted the secondary armament. Later in the war, the larger gun was replaced on some boats by additional anti-aircraft guns. To support these classes, special supply submarines were built large enough to carry supplies, enabling the attack U-boats to remain on station longer. Previously, they could only lengthen their patrols by storing food and other supplies in existing living compartments, leaving the conditions on board even more squalid than they were normally. Such milch cow submarines displaced almost 2,000 tons and could carry up to 432 tons of oil, in addition to food and other supplies. Only 10 were commissioned. By limiting large-scale production of U-boats to the 2 main designs, the Germans found it difficult to improve performance, whereas British and American boats were constructed in classes built either for a specific purpose or to reflect technical advances. The relatively small size of most U-boats also limited how much additional equipment, like new communication systems or radars, could be fitted. Living conditions on both these classes were poor. The crew had to sleep wherever they could find space, which was often on top of the torpedoes. A crew had to share one toilet. The temperature could be very hot or freezing cold. Air conditioning was non-existent. With little room for food or water, rations were basic, and the crew often went for weeks or months without washing or shaving. After being underwater for hours, the air would become stale, and there was always the possibility of a slow, lingering death or of instantaneous destruction. But by 1943, it was becoming more obvious that these outdated designs would not be able to match new Allied anti-submarine warfare techniques. New concepts had to be found. The first of these was the schnorkel-fitted high-speed submarine with a much greater battery capacity, designed for continuous submerged patrols. Such submarines would be far less vulnerable to the long-range aircraft the Allies were now using to hunt for submarines on the surface. At the same time, the gun armament was to be sacrificed for a much more streamlined hull, with a resulting increase in speed. Over 12 knots could be maintained underwater, a substantial improvement on the 4 knots achieved by the earlier designs. 2 types of submarine were to be built using these principles: the Type 21 for long-range deep-sea patrols, and the Type 23 for coastal duties. Their high underwater speeds could only be maintained for short periods before the batteries needed recharging. The answer to this problem was a gas-driven closed turbine, which would be independent of external air. This system had been developed by an engineer called Helmut Walter, who used hydrogen peroxide as the gas. Development was slow, however, and only a few experimental submarines were built. No U-boats using this system ever entered service. On the whole, German submarines were good conventional types, well fitted for their purpose, but the German Navy stayed with the early submarines for too long before incorporating radical technologies. By the time they became available, it was too late. The battle had been lost.